The North Pole has been frozen for 100,000 years, but according to scientists, by the end of this century, that won't be true anymore. The top of the world is melting. There's been a debate burning for years about the causes of global warming, but the scientists you're about to meet say the debate is over. New evidence shows that man is contributing to the warming of the planet, pumping out greenhouse gases that trap solar heat. Much of this new evidence was compiled by an American scientist, Bob Carell. He led a study called the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. It's an awkward name, but listen to the findings. The seas are rising. Hurricanes will be more powerful like Katrina, and polar bears may be headed toward extinction. What does the melting Arctic look like? We went north to see what Bob Carell calls a global warning. Towers of ice, the height of 10-story buildings, rise on the coast of Greenland. It's the biggest ice sheet in the northern hemisphere, 700,000 square miles. But temperatures in the Arctic are rising twice as fast as the rest of the world, so a lot of Greenland's ice is running out to sea.
Right now, the planet is out of balance.
Bob Carell is among the world's top authorities on climate change. He led 300 scientists from 8 nations in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, and he believes he's seen the future.
This is a bellwether, a barometer, as some people call it, the canary in the mine, the warning that things are coming. In 10 years here in the Arctic, we see what the rest of the planet will see in 25 or 30 years from now.
Look at what's happened in 26 years. That's the North Pole in September 1979. This is 6 months ago. Have another look at that. 26 years ago, and now.
The glacier's been receding for the last 50 years, so...
Back in 1987, President Reagan asked Carell to look into climate change, and he's been at it ever since. In Iceland, he showed us glaciers that were growing until the 1990s are now melting. In fact, 98% of all the world's mountain glaciers are melting. Carell says all that water will push sea levels 3 feet higher all around the world in 100 years.
You and I sit here, another foot. Your children, another foot. Your grandchildren, another foot. And it won't take very long for sea level to inundate. This lake will go all the way back to there. Sea level will be inundating the lowlands of virtually every country of the world, ours included.
To find the sights and sounds of the Arctic melting, there are few places better than this. This is a fjord in Greenland, and the glacier is just a short distance up this way. What I'm standing on is a huge block of ice that split off from the glacier recently and dropped into the sea. It's a big iceberg at this point. This part of Greenland is melting faster than just about any other. And to get a sense of the enormity of what's happening, consider this. The ice that is melting here is the equivalent of all of the ice in the Alps. That's more than 105 million acres of melted ice in 15 years. And just 4 minutes after we cleared off this berg, our ice joined in. We saw how unstable the ice is becoming on a flight with glaciologist Carl Bogild. Bogild anchored 10 research stations to the ice, but every time he comes to visit, the ice and his stations have moved.
One of the really impressive things you see from the air are all these fissures, these crevasses that are breaking through the ice everywhere. What causes this?
This is actually the ice flow, where you have so much tension in the ice that it cannot stick together and it breaks and opens a crevasse which goes about 150, 200 feet down.
And it's melting.
It's also melting on the side, yes.
I think you can hear it down there. It's a little river.
It's like a small river.
A leading theory says those little rivers are lubricating the bottom of the ice sheet, helping it move off the bedrock and out to sea.
There goes Greenland.
Yeah, that's true.
And there may be no stopping it. Arctic warming is accelerating. It's a chain reaction. As snow and ice melt, they reveal dark land and water that absorb solar heat. That melts more snow and ice, and round it goes. There's long been a debate about how much of this is Earth's naturally changing climate and how much is man's doing. Paul Majewski at the University of Maine says the answer to that question is frozen right here.
We'll go over here and take a look at an ice core that we got from Greenland.
With funding from the National Science Foundation, Majewski has led 35 expeditions collecting deep ice cores from glaciers. The ice captures everything in the air, so it lays down an atmospheric record that covers 500,000 years.
We can go to any section of the ice core, tell basically what the greenhouse gas levels were. We can tell whether or not it was stormy, what the temperatures were like.
We brought Majewski back to Greenland, where he says his research has proven that the ice and the atmosphere have man's fingerprints all over them.
Looking back through this record, frozen in time, we haven't seen temperature changes like this in how long?
We haven't seen a temperature rise to this level going back at least 2,000 years and arguably several thousand years.
We haven't seen CO2 levels like this in how long?
We haven't seen CO2 levels like this in hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years.
What does that tell you?
It all points to something that has changed and something that has impacted the system, which wasn't doing it more than 100 years ago, and we know exactly what it is. It's human activity.
Activity like burning fossil fuels, releasing carbon dioxide or CO2, and other greenhouse gases. The U.S. is by far the largest polluter. Carell says there's so much greenhouse gas in the air already that more temperature rise is inevitable.
Are you saying that if tomorrow we stopped every car, every truck, every power plant, stopped all greenhouse gas emissions, the planet would continue to warm anyway?
Absolutely. It will continue to warm for about another degree.
That's enough to melt the Arctic, and if greenhouse gases continue to increase, the temperature will rise even more. The ice that's melting already is changing the weather by disrupting ocean currents. Carell points to floods in the U.S., heat waves in Europe, and we wanted to know about this past catastrophic hurricane season.
The one thing I think we can say with a fairly high degree of confidence is the severity of the storms, how strong the storms, these cyclonic events like hurricanes and cyclones in the Pacific are going to get, there's going to be more severe. Now, one thing that is in doubt is whether there'll be more of them.
But the intensity is going to be worse.
The oceans of the northern hemisphere are the warmest they've been on record. When they get up in that temperature, they spin off hurricanes. Well, if it goes up a degree and up another degree, it's going to spawn these with more intensity.
So when people say, where's the harm in global warming, you say,
here's one of them.
The name Arctic comes from ancient Greek, meaning land of the Great Bear. But the warming climate is threatening this icon of the Arctic, the polar bear. Flying above the subarctic region of Hudson Bay, Canadian scientist Nick Lunn is hunting polar bears in a 30-year study that tracks their health. It's the job of his assistant, Evan Richardson, to take them down with a tranquilizer dart.
don't tell me you're going to touch him with a 10-foot pole.
This bear's got a little bit of a head movement, so we're just going to use the pole just to check without having to get necessarily too close. Hey, bear! Hey!
It's only when a polar bear is essentially paralyzed for certain and for hours.
You just grab him by the fur and
just like this,
and pull him.
And 1, 2, 3.
That doing this is recommended.
Wow.
The polar bear is the largest predator on land, and native people here say he'll even hunt humans, but not today.
He just can't move his legs at all, can he?
No.
With the tranquilizer, the bear remains awake, but immobile. They know this bear by his tattoo.
This is bear X19788.
His history is written chapter and verse in the Bear Bible.
This is the record book of all the bears that have been handled either by us or Manitoba Conservation.
The study began here at the Wapust National Park because the bear population was thought to be the healthiest in the world.
These paws and claws are really amazing.
Lund's annual checkup records changes in fat,
And then we get a measure of the bear's straight line length
dimensions,
from the nose to the tip of the tail.
and an inventory of weapons. The polar bear uses those teeth to hunt primarily one thing, seal, and that's where Arctic warming comes in. The polar bear can only hunt on the ice, and Lund says the ice is breaking up 3 weeks earlier than it did 30 years ago. Now he's finding female bears 55 pounds lighter, weaker mothers with fewer cubs.
How big was the population a couple of decades ago when you started this, and how big is it now?
Well, when we first started doing this research, we've done inventories in the mid-80s and the mid-90s, and both times we came out with an estimate of approximately 1,200 animals for what is known as the Western Hudson Bay population. And the numbers now suggest that the population has declined to below 1,000.
The bears are unlikely to survive as a species if there's a complete loss of ice in summer, which the Arctic study projects will happen by the end of this century. There are skeptics who question climate change projections like that, saying they're no more reliable than your local weatherman. But Paul Majewski says Arctic projections done decades ago are proving accurate.
The skeptics have brought up some very, very interesting issues over the last few years, and they've forced us to think more and more about the data that we collect. And we can owe the skeptics a vote of thanks for making our science as precise as it is today.
One big supporter of climate science is the Bush administration, spending $5 billion a year on research. But Mr. Bush refuses to sign a treaty forcing cuts in greenhouse gases. The White House also declined our request for an interview. Bob Carell, who first studied the issue for President Reagan, believes that the facts are in on climate change, even if President Bush does not.
When you look at the American government, which is saying essentially, wait a minute, we need to study this some more, we can't flip our energy use overnight, it would hurt the economy. When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, what I do then is I try to tell them exactly what we know scientifically. The science is, I believe, unassailable. I'm not arguing their policy. That's their business, how they deal with policy. But my job is to say, scientifically, shorten that time scale so that you don't push out the effects of climate change into the long, long distant future, because even under the best of circumstances, this natural system of a climate will continue to warm the planet for literally hundreds of years, no matter what we do.
As a government scientist, James Hansen is taking a risk. He says there are things that the White House doesn't want you to hear, but he's going to say them anyway. Hansen is arguably the world's leading researcher on global warming. He's the head of NASA's top institute studying the climate. But this eminent scientist says that the Bush administration is restricting who he can talk to and editing what he can say. Politicians, he says, are rewriting the science. Well, there'll be none of that tonight, because James Hansen is telling what he knows on 60 Minutes.
You believe that the administration is censoring what you can say to the public?
Well, they're censoring whether or not I can say it. I mean, I say what I believe, if I'm allowed to say it.
What James Hansen believes is that global warming is accelerating. He points to the melting Arctic and to Antarctica, where new data show massive losses of ice to the sea.
Is it fair to say at this point that humans control the climate? Is that possible?
There's no doubt about that. The natural changes, the speed of the natural changes is now dwarfed by the changes that humans are making to the atmosphere and to the surface.
Those human changes, he says, are driven by burning fossil fuels, which pump out greenhouse gases like CO2, carbon dioxide. Hansen says that his research shows man has just 10 years to begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or global warming will reach what he calls a tipping point and will become unstoppable. He says the White House is blocking that message.
In my more than 3 decades in the government, I've never witnessed such restrictions on the ability of scientists to communicate with the public.
Restrictions like this email that Hansen's Institute received from NASA in 2004. There is a new review process. The White House is now reviewing all climate-related press releases. Why the scrutiny of Hansen's work? Well, his Goddard Institute for Space Studies is the source of respected but sobering research on warming. It recently announced 2005 was the warmest year on record. Hansen started at NASA more than 30 years ago and spent nearly all of that time studying the Earth. How important is his work? We asked someone at the top, Ralph Cicerone, president of the nation's leading institute of science, the National Academy of Sciences.
I can't think of anybody who I would say is better than Hansen. You might argue that there's 2 or 3 others as good, but nobody better.
And Cicerone, who's an atmospheric chemist, said the same thing that every leading scientist told us.
Climate change is really happening.
So what is causing the changes?
Well, the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane and chlorofluorocarbons and a couple of others, which are all the increases in their concentrations in the air are due to human activities. It's that simple.
But if it is that simple, why do climate science reports look like this after they've been edited at the White House, with science labeled not sufficiently reliable? It's a tone of scientific uncertainty that the president set in his first months in office after he pulled out of a global treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
We do not know how much our climate could or will change in the future. We do not know how fast change will occur, or even how some of our actions could impact it.
That ambiguity annoyed Hansen, so he went public a year and a half ago saying this about the Bush administration in a talk at the University of Iowa.
I find a willingness to listen only to those portions of scientific results that fit predetermined, inflexible positions. This, I believe, is a recipe for environmental disasters.
Ever since he said that, NASA's been keeping an eye on Hansen. NASA let us sit down with him, but only with a NASA representative taping the interview. Other interviews have been denied.
And I object to the fact that I'm not able to freely communicate via the media. National Public Radio wanted to interview me, and they were told that they would need to instead interview someone at NASA headquarters. And the comment was made that they didn't want Jim Hansen going on the most liberal media in the nation. So I don't think that kind of decision should be made on that kind of basis. I think that we should be able to communicate the science.
Politically, Hansen calls himself an independent, and he's had trouble with both parties. He says from time to time the Clinton administration wanted to hear that warming was worse than it was, but Hansen refused to spin the science that way.
Should we be simply doing our science and reporting it rigorously, or to what degree the administration in power has the right to assume that you should be a spokesman for the administration? I've tried to be a straight scientist doing the science and reporting it as best I can.
Dozens of federal agencies report science, and much of it is edited at the White House before it's sent to Congress and the public. It appears that climate science is edited with a heavy hand. These drafts of climate reports were co-written by Rick Piltz for the Federal Climate Change Science Program. But Piltz says his work was edited by the White House to make global warming seem less threatening.
The strategy of people with a political agenda to avoid this issue is to say, there is so much to study way upstream here that we can't even begin to discuss impacts and response strategies. There's much too much uncertainty. And it's not climate scientists who are saying that. It's lawyers. It's politicians.
Piltz worked under the Clinton and Bush administrations, and each year he helped write a report to Congress called Our Changing Planet. You're responsible for editing Our Changing Planet, and you send a review draft to the White House. What happens?
It comes back with a large number of edits, handwritten on the hard copy by the Chief of Staff of the Council on Environmental Quality.
And the Chief of Staff is whom?
Phil Cooney.
He is a scientist?
No, he's a lawyer. It was a lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute before going into the White House.
Phil Cooney, the former oil industry lobbyist, became Chief of Staff at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Piltz says Cooney edited climate reports in his own hand. Here, a line that said Earth is undergoing rapid change becomes maybe undergoing change. Uncertainty becomes significant remaining uncertainty. This line that says energy production contributes to warming is just crossed out.
He was obviously passing it through a political screen. He would put in the word potential or may, or weaken or delete text that had to do with the likely consequences of climate change.
Here, Piltz says that Cooney added this line: the uncertainties remain so great as to preclude meaningfully informed decision-making. References to human health are marked out. We obtained the drafts from the Government Accountability Project. The edits you're seeing made it into the final report. Here's that phrase, Earth may be undergoing change, in the report to Congress. Piltz says there wasn't room at the White House for those who disagreed, so he resigned.
I mean, even to raise issues internally is immediately career limiting. That's why you will find not too many people in the federal agencies who will speak freely about all the things they know, unless they're retired or unless they're ready to resign.
Jim Hansen isn't retiring or resigning because he believes Earth is nearing a point of no return. He urged us to look north to the Arctic, where temperatures are rising twice as fast as the rest of the world. We saw for ourselves the accelerating melt of the largest ice sheet in the north.
Here in Greenland, about 15 years ago, the ice sheet extended to right about where I'm standing now. Today, it's back there, between those hills in that shaded area. Glaciologists call this a melt stream, but these days it's more like a melt river.
The Bush administration doesn't deny global warming or that man plays a role. The administration is spending billions of dollars on climate research. Hansen gives the White House credit for the research, but he says what's urgent now is action.
We have to, in the next 10 years, get off of this exponential curve and begin to decrease the rate of growth of CO2 emissions and then flatten it out. And before we get to the middle of the century, we've got to be on a declining curve.
And if that doesn't start within 10 years, what happens?
If that doesn't start within 10 years, then I don't think we can keep global warming, additional global warming, under 1 degree Celsius. And that means that there's a great danger of passing some of these tipping points. If the ice sheets once begin to disintegrate, what can you do about it? You can't tie a rope around the ice sheet. You can't build a wall around the ice sheets. It will be a situation that is out of our control.
But it's not a situation you'll find in this federal report. Government scientists wanted to tell you about the ice sheets, but before this draft left the White House, the paragraph on glacial melt and flooding was crossed out, and this was added, straying from research strategy into speculative findings and musings here. Hansen says that kind of editing happened to him once during a presentation when a top official scolded him for using the word danger.
I think we know a lot more about the tipping points. I think we know about the dangers of even a moderate degree of additional global warming, about the potential effects in the Arctic, about the potential effects on the ice sheets.
You just used that word again that you're not supposed to use. Danger.
Yeah, it is a danger.
For months, we've been trying to talk with the president's science advisor, but we were finally told that he would never be available. Phil Cooney, the editor at the Council on Environmental Quality, didn't return our calls, but in June, he left the White House and went to work for ExxonMobil.
One of the most significant efforts to study changes in the climate has been taking place near the top of the world. It's a place called Petermann Glacier in Greenland, one of the largest glaciers in the Arctic Circle, and a glacier that has experienced dramatic melting. It is a harsh and dangerous environment, and it has drawn some of the world's leading climate scientists who are only able to work there a little over a month a year. We wanted to see how that work is proceeding, how they're able to move equipment and people in such a hostile place, and what they've discovered so far. So we went to the top of the world to find out. Our journey took us 700 miles above the Arctic Circle to the U.S.'s Thule Air Force Base in northern Greenland, built at the start of the Cold War to watch for Soviet missiles. It is an alien landscape, home to curious Arctic hares and packs of prehistoric-looking muskox. From there,
Hi, I'm Sharyn.
Welcome to Greenland. I'm Malik.
We flew even further. The destination, Petermann Glacier. It's on the northwest coast of Greenland, just a few hundred miles south of the North Pole. To get there in a helicopter took us 4 hours over a rarely seen landscape that is both severe and serene. The last town we'd see was Qaanaaq, with 700 residents and more huskies than people. Locked in by ice 9 months of the year, villagers have always hunted seal and narwhal to survive. Greenland is 3 times the size of Texas, and 80% of it is covered in ice. But it now loses more ice than it gains in snowfall every year. We saw evidence of the imbalance everywhere. Blue gashes across the ice, rivers of rushing meltwater, and the occasional thunderous crack of icebergs dropping into the sea. We still had 300 miles to go and stopped twice to refuel along the way. These barrels were left behind for us by the scientists who made the trip to Petermann Glacier 3 weeks earlier.
This is the ultimate self-service gas station. In the middle of nowhere. And this will keep us going for how much longer?
Yeah, we can fly 2.5 hours.
Our pilots, native Greenlanders, kept a rifle nearby at each stop to protect us from polar bears.
Have you seen polar bears out here?
Yeah, a lot. So now it's ready. Now we're safe.
Finally, we arrived at Petermann Glacier.
Oh, there's the camp.
And spotted the ice camp below.
Great to see you.
So who did you upset to get put out here?
Oh no, the gods.
Keith Nichols is an expert in drilling in remote places. And in terms of remote, this would be really hard to beat.
It feels like you're on another planet.
If you could take a walk around here, you could be expecting Scotty to beam you up. I mean, it is extraordinary.
Nichols and a team of scientists were drawn to this remote sliver of Greenland in part by these satellite images. In 2010, a chunk of ice 4 times the size of Manhattan broke off. Then, 2 years later, another large chunk came down. The glacier has receded by 20 miles in 5 years. Nichols and his team are trying to drill beneath it.
This is a lot of work in difficult conditions. What do you hope to learn?
What we're trying to learn is how the oceans are interacting with the ice, how they're melting it. We're trying to predict how in the future that melting might change.
To drill through the ice, they heated meltwater from the glacier to make a hot water drill to pierce through the 300-foot thick ice.
There has to be serious challenge to running equipment like this in this kind of weather.
The biggest challenge is we've got water and it's very cold. So if we have water freezing in hoses, that can be devastating for the projects.
This is the moment the coring machine struck the bottom of the sea floor. A half-mile beneath the ice, they made history. It was the first time anyone has ever collected sediment from beneath the ice shelf in Greenland.
The ocean beneath ice shelves is probably the least accessible part of the world ocean. And just getting access to that is a triumph, frankly, as far as we're concerned.
The ice shelf extends out from the glacier and floats on the ocean. They believe it acts like a dam, holding back the ice from sliding into the sea. If it goes away, sea levels go up.
Is there a sense of urgency in the work that you're doing?
So sea level rise is the big question that we're trying to get at. And Petermann Glacier, this experiment here, gives us an opportunity to get at those processes, to try and understand the basic physics as to how that can happen.
Our visit to the ice camp was cut short. Our pilots warned us something called ice fog was moving in and could strand us here for days. We hightailed it back to the helicopter, heading to another outpost of the expedition, what the scientists call Boulder Camp, set up on the edge of Petermann Glacier. Sean Marcotte and a team of geologists have been here for weeks, gathering samples from rocks.
So this was probably deposited when the ice was maybe a few hundred to a few thousand feet thicker. And when it was deposited, you're probably talking about maybe 500-600 feet of ice above us.
Above where we are.
Above where we are now. Petermann would have been much larger, and it would have been dropping these rocks all over the surface.
To the person at home who's looking at you guys just chipping away at rocks and going, why should I care about this?
We know that if you warm the planet up, the glaciers respond, they melt. The question is, at what rate? How fast is that going to happen, and where is it going to happen, and where are the most vulnerable spots of this ice sheet? To understand all of that, you have to understand how the ice sheet, what controls an ice sheet. We need to understand this glacier so that we can provide a better prediction for the larger ice sheet. That matters to us because of sea level. If these glaciers can respond dynamically, then we should all be concerned because that can create dynamic changes in sea level and flood infrastructure. And we need to know that for planning for the future.
We camped out next to the scientists. With 24 hours of light, we slept in these tents under the midnight sun. In the morning, we were shuttled out to meet the Odin, a Swedish icebreaker making its way around Petermann Glacier. The Odin supports the scientists on land and acts as a floating laboratory. Named after a Norse god who relentlessly sought wisdom, it's home to more than 50 climate scientists from around the world with similar convictions. Their work is funded mostly by the Swedish government and the U.S.'s National Science Foundation. Larry Mayer is one of the geologists on the Odin. He's using sonar to map the ocean floor, creating the first detailed maps that show how Petermann Glacier slid into the sea. You can see it, like skid marks of a car at an accident scene.
Yeah, the ice went here and the ice went there. And we can see, oh, it stopped here.
How much of the world's oceans have been mapped with this kind of detail?
Oh, probably on the order of 6 or 7%. Very, very little, yeah.
You can only make the trip to Petermann Glacier a few weeks each summer when the ice melts enough to allow passage.
You can see those blocks of ice drifting by.
Expedition leader Alan Mix is running the ship's coring operation, trying to grab sediment from the sea floor.
It's actually our coring site right now is under that block of ice, and we just can't get there. So we're trying to drift with the ice and just sort of sneak up on it gently.
It's hard to sneak up on anything in an icebreaker. The Odin doesn't so much as sail as it does smash the ice like a 13,000-ton hammer. Once in position, they throw something called a piston core, like a dart, at the bottom of the ocean.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
After multiple attempts,
Go to the next one, but we'll hit it with a gravity core.
a core sample like this is collected. Inside the ship's lab, the multi-year process of investigating those cores begins.
What's your best guess? How old is this?
So the base of this core probably is no more than 10,000 years.
Ann Jennings is with the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research. She says each core holds clues about Petermann Glacier's past.
Well, we didn't really expect to find things living under the ice shelf, but we have.
What have you found?
This one we found is called Cibicidoides woolerstorfi. It has a big name for a little bug.
Easy for you to say. It looks like a little seashell.
And it is a seashell, but it's a single-celled animal.
That single-celled animal, like all living creatures, is made out of carbon, allowing scientists to determine when it lived.
Which tells you what?
The age of the sediments. So we can take then the depth scale here and convert it to age. And then we can say, when did the ice retreat? How quickly did it retreat? Was there a lot of meltwater coming out?
You can get all that from what looks like mud.
Yes.
After a week in Greenland, we headed home, but the scientists kept working, taking advantage of the final days of the short Arctic summer. The 66 core samples they collected during their month at sea will be studied by scientists around the world for decades.
This is the largest core repository in the world.
Peter Domenical is a paleoclimatologist at Columbia University. He says the cores collected in Greenland are like a black box of the Earth's inner workings. This one he collected just south of Greenland.
So this is today's climate, and we've had about 10,000 years of relatively warm climate. And then we go 10,000 years in the past, boom, there's the last ice age. This is when Long Island was formed, when Cape Cod was formed. You can go on and you can just find this color, and this is filled with these rocks, what we called ice-rafted detritus, until this period, when, whoa, there's another warm phase, and then another cold phase, and then another warm phase, a short cold phase, a longer warm phase, and then boom, another ice age. And so you've had cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm today.
How do we know that the warming we're seeing now, and how do we not know it's part of this warm, cold, warm, cold?
That's a great question. These transitions are gradual and kind of almost like a tide wave or something. And this transition, when you get to today, goes boom, suddenly very warm.
Domenical says the cores pulled from Petermann Glacier will fill in a crucial piece of the climate change puzzle.
How impressive was it that they got to Petermann Glacier?
It's impressive. What's more impressive is that we haven't been there every year and that we're not doing this every year. We should be doing this, we should be monitoring this whole system with much greater focus than we are now.
How quickly have we seen the changes in Greenland?
The changes that are happening right now as a result of human activities are remarkable, and they're happening incredibly fast, and it's not only happening fast, but it's accelerating. And it's important to really get our mind around what we're saying there. We're not just saying that climate in the Arctic is changing, it's changing at an accelerating rate. So it basically means it's starting to melt, but it's melting at a faster and faster clip. So anyone who knows what it's like to fall off a cliff, that's what it's doing.
The morning of November 8th, a massive wildfire tore through California mountain communities north of Sacramento. Because it started near Camp Creek Road, it was called the Camp Fire. The cause is still under investigation. But within a couple of hours, it devoured the town of Paradise, population 27,000. About 95% of Paradise was lost. Its smaller neighbors, Concow and Magalia, were all but destroyed. Until now, last year's wildfire in California's wine country was the worst on record in the state. The Federal Climate Report released last month warns increasing extreme heat and drought conditions could make future wildfires even worse. Tonight, we'll take you into the campfire and show you what the firefighters saw. That video and the destruction had us wondering how anything could be worse. This is Paradise, or what remains of it, block after ashen block of burned houses and ruined lives. 3 weeks ago, children played here, people shopped here, and families prayed here. The wildfire that roared through Paradise was as random as it was merciless. In just a few terrifying hours, it killed about 90 people and destroyed almost 19,000 buildings, businesses, and homes. Paradise sits in the heart of Butte County. On the morning of November 8th, County Sheriff and Coroner Corey Honey woke up and saw an ominous glow. He knew it was a fire, and it was heading his way. So at what point in the morning did you realize that you had to evacuate this whole town?
I think the best way that I can characterize it is it was outrunning us before we even knew we were in a race or what direction the race was going to take us. It was dark. It seemed like it was nighttime because the smoke had blocked out the sun. Ash and embers were raining down. And as the fire grew closer, there was this real sense of it being hell on earth.
Mandatory evacuations all of Paradise. Get people moving now!
The sheriff quickly mobilized his deputies. Firefighters raced to defend the town, but they were overwhelmed. The fire was too fast and too big.
Oncoming!
Strike Team 9231C found themselves driving straight into the inferno. The crew shot this video from the truck.
This thing's gonna make a hard left.
Captain John Jessen was behind the wheel. He told us he's seen many wildfires in his 24 years as a California state firefighter, but all paled compared to this. What made this one so different?
The fire front that was coming up the canyon was literally miles long and 200-foot flame length. It's hard to describe how fast this fire was moving.
Residents fleeing the maelstrom had turned all routes out of Paradise into gridlock death traps. The strike team got caught in the traffic jam.
Why are these people here? They need to get the out of here.
Panicked people abandoned their cars. A sheriff's deputy captured the chaos on his body cam.
Hey guys!
4 people made their way to the strike team truck, including Eva Walker. What was the fire doing at this point?
The bushes were catching on fire, the trees were on fire, so you're moving to get away from the flames, but there's nowhere to move to.
She thought she'd been saved when the strike team pulled her into the truck. Captain Jessen made a desperate radio call for air support, but the smoke was too thick, the winds too strong for help from above.
The destruction.
Firefighter Casey Peck quietly started to pray.
And I was just thinking to myself, just praying like, please, Lord, be merciful and watch over us, watch over our families.
You were praying for your life?
Yeah.
Just then, through the darkness, 2 lights appeared. A firefighter driving a bulldozer responded to Jessen's call for help and started clearing an escape route.
All of a sudden, the bulldozer, who I swear to God is an angel, was the one who came through. I don't know where that man came from. I mean, who does that? Who drives into the flames? He did.
You called him an angel?
Called him an angel. He saved all of us.
Her angel was bulldozer driver Joe Kennedy.
So I was taking the burning cars and pushing them off the road away from the people in the cars that weren't on fire.
Sam Layton was behind Kennedy in another fire truck. Both opened their doors to let people in.
It was a blessing and a curse to go to that fire, but I'm happy that I was there to help people.
Layton, Kennedy, and the strike team took 9 civilians to safety, then turned around, went back in, and saved more.
There's points where you're scared or where you think, I shouldn't have come this far into the fire. But at the same time, you have to keep going because lives and property are at stake.
We were in a situation where there weren't enough fire engines and there weren't enough law enforcement officers.
The resources all overwhelmed by this fire?
Absolutely.
How would you describe this fire?
Apocalyptic.
Using this new tool, Ken Pimlott, chief of the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, showed us how fast the campfire spread. Computerized projections on this 3D map chart the course of the fire. Where did the fire start?
Fire started in the community of Polga at about 6:30 in the morning on November 8th, and it was quickly accelerated by 40-mile-an-hour winds coming from the north.
Look at this.
The fire was growing at this time at a rate of 1 football field a second, so an acre a second.
Football field a second?
Yes. Within 2 hours, the fire is impacting the community of Paradise. It took 12 hours to essentially consume all of that. That was a record pace.
How many acres in total?
153,300 acres.
Wow. What's going on? Everyone says that this is the new normal.
We're now every year seeing fires like this that are becoming more and more extreme. We had 5 years of drought. The vegetation is critically parched. Our temperatures, the mean temperature in the state is going up. And so these are all factors that are just really a combination of things that are driving very extreme events.
The same day wildfire razed Paradise, the Woolsey Fire erupted in Southern California. The wind-whipped flames killed 3 people, destroyed 1,500 structures, and burned more than 90,000 acres in and around Malibu. The brown, fire-scarred terrain can be seen from space. Californians have to learn to live with fires like this?
These fires are showing no sign of letting up. There's no reason for them to stop based on the conditions that we're seeing.
Hey, any luck on tracking that fellow down?
As sheriff, Corey Honey is coordinating law enforcement's response in Paradise.
This is horrible work, and I'm sorry that you have to do it.
As coroner, he's overseen the search of every structure burned in the fire, looking for remains. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, there were nearly 1,300 people unaccounted for. That number has fallen to 25. How do you check every site?
Yeah, it's unprecedented. We have brought in search teams from all throughout California, urban search rescue, coroners teams, forensic anthropologists, to see if we can determine whether or not there are human remains there. And if they are, of course, we want to recover them and do what's necessary to return those remains to the family.
Can you tell me what the search team is doing behind us right now?
Because this fire burned so hot and so intensely, those remains are often completely consumed or nearly completely consumed. And so these guys are looking for bones or bone fragments, which is why we have the anthropologists here to help identify those.
Search crews and volunteer anthropologists and medical examiners meticulously sifted through ash and debris as though on an archaeological dig, zeroing in on bathrooms, front doors, porches, places people might seek shelter or get trapped. It was detailed, sacred work. Remains were removed in blue body bags. Some, the charred fragments, fit in brown paper bags. All the body bags were brought to the morgue in Sacramento. So once you get these remains, how are you trying to identify who the victim is?
Early on, we were able to use some of the more traditional means of identifying human remains, including fingerprints, dental records, things of that nature. And we'll continue to do that where that's possible. But at this point, what we're finding, we're going to mostly have to rely upon DNA analysis.
In mass casualty disasters, identifying remains using DNA normally takes months. The sheriff turned to a new rapid DNA identification technology. It was used here for the first time in a disaster zone. Inventor Dr. Richard Selden says he can identify remains in just hours. These victims were incinerated. How much material do you need to analyze to come up with a match?
Just a swab, a Q-tip that had been rubbed against the right tissue, or a small fragment of bone, sometimes a small fragment of muscle or liver. That very small fragment would allow us to get the DNA ID and in many, many cases, solve the case, make the identification.
Did you fear or worry that you might not be able to get some material that you could use to identify people?
I was shocked when I saw the first remains. The kind of samples I handled, I was pretty sure weren't going to work. I told our technical team, let's do it anyway, 5% chance. And the first 8 samples all worked perfectly.
Selden set up shop in a rented RV in the coroner's parking lot.
This is it. This is somebody.
He took a process that once required an entire lab and shrunk it down to a piece of plastic. Swabs of body tissue or bone are placed inside what he calls the chip, where DNA is purified and separated. The results are matched with DNA samples provided by relatives. By the end of last week, 41 victims had been identified, 31 of them with rapid DNA. Has the technology proven true to the promise?
We've been very pleased with the technology, not only in terms of its ability to confirm the identities, but the speed with which it's able to do that. The longer that process is, the worse it is for the family, in my view.
78-year-old Marie Weehee lived alone in the deep woods just outside Paradise. Her children, Bonnie and Tommy, and his wife Lisa, last heard from Marie the night before the fire.
She said, "I love you," and I love you too. I haven't spoke to her since.
For 12 days, they searched and hoped to find Marie in a shelter. They heard the sheriff was encouraging relatives of the missing to provide DNA samples. 5 days after Bonnie and Tommy gave their swabs, a match was made. Their mother's remains were found in her truck, not far from her house. What does that knowing do for you?
We know she's been found.
It's on the road to recovery. I don't know if you can ever say we'll ever recover from this, but it gives us peace of mind to know that we can try to get some closure and that we have found her.
Yeah.
So
she's not going to be missing forever.
No.
The campfire destroyed just about everything in Paradise. After fires like this, nature has a way of rebounding. The question is, can Paradise?
On the morning of November 8th, there was a thriving community, and in a matter of hours, it's wiped out, it's gone.
How do you recover from something like this?
Well, when that happens, I'll let you know, but we have a long road ahead of us.
At least 31 have died in the largest wildfires in California history. The East is defending itself against twice the usual number of tropical cyclones and what may be the highest temperature ever recorded on Earth came in August in the United States. It's a torrid 2020, and it was forecast 32 years ago. In the 1980s, a NASA scientist named James Hansen discovered that climate change driven by carbon emissions was upon us. His graphs of 3 decades ago accurately trace the global rise in temperature to the year 2020. Last week, we had a lot of questions for Hansen. Are these disasters climate change? Do things get worse? Is it too late to do anything? But before we get to the causes, let us show you the effects. Butte County, California, Volunteer Fire Station 61.
How long has the fire station been here?
About 35 years.
And how long have you been here?
28 and a half years.
Reed Rankin is chief of what was Station 61. He's spent his life in the community of Berry Creek. He's on the school board and built his home with his own hands.
Tell me what your home looks like right now.
Nothing but a foundation with metal roof on top of it. It's completely burned out.
School burned down?
Yeah, completely. All the buildings on it burned down. Nothing left.
15 people died in that inferno the second week in September north of Sacramento, where the Central Valley folds into the Sierra Nevada.
These are fires that nobody, when I started in this business, ever even dreamed of happening in California. Not even close.
California State Fire Chief Tom Porter started in this business in 1999. That year, just over 1 million acres burned. By 2007, it was 1.5 million. In 2018, 2 million. This season, nearly 4 million acres have burned so far. Climate isn't the only reason. Decades of aggressively putting out every forest fire allowed brush to pile up like kindling. But the warming climate has intensified heat and drought. Chief Porter showed us the length of the fire lines he's defending right now would stretch from L.A. to New York.
They talk about career fires. And a career fire was sometimes on the order of 10,000 to 50,000 acres. 50,000, that's crazy.
The kind of thing a firefighter would see once in his career.
Correct. Once in a career. It dawned on me at one point that career fires are happening every single year. Right now, today, there are 10 fires in California that are 100,000 acres plus, and one that's 850,000 acres plus.
4% of the state has burned in total. The largest fires were ignited by storms, but because the air is so dry, the rain evaporated before it reached the ground, leaving Chief Porter fighting dry lightning.
I'm afraid without significant change in the moisture that we get from the atmosphere, we're going to continue to see this getting worse and worse and worse.
How much of California can burn?
Every acre in California can and will burn someday.
California smoke blew more than 2,000 miles to the east and drifted over the Pennsylvania farm of retired NASA scientist James Hansen. His 1988 paper on carbon and climate accurately predicted temperatures up to the far-off year of 2020.
Yeah, we're seeing exactly what we expected, but I expected that governments would be wise enough that they would begin to adopt policies to preserve the future for young people, but they haven't done that yet.
Hansen is the father of climate change science. For 32 years, he was director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Today, at 79, he runs the program on climate science at Columbia University. What is your forecast for the next 30 years?
Well, if we don't change anything, then we're going to continue to see more and more of these extreme regional events, because the physics is quite simple. As you add more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, you increase the heating of the surface. So at the times and places where it's dry, you get more extreme droughts, the fire seasons become longer, the fires burn hotter. But at the times and places where it's wet, you get more evaporation of the water and you get warmer, moist air, which provides greater rainfall, and it's the fuel for storms.
This summer, the Atlantic Basin has soaked beneath 23 tropical storms or hurricanes, double the usual number. Death Valley, California hit 130 degrees, now being evaluated as a world record, and Los Angeles reached 120.
People ask, are we dealing with a new normal? And the sobering answer is, that's the best case scenario. A new normal is the best case scenario, because that sort of means we've got a new situation and we just have to learn how to deal with it. But it's much worse than that. So there are surprises in store, and we're seeing some of those surprises play out now.
Michael Mann is a geophysicist whose work on past climate showed today's rate of warming began with the Industrial Revolution. Mann is a lightning rod for deniers, but his research has been verified again and again. Mann is director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. But There have always been fires in the West. There have always been hurricanes in the East. How do we know that climate change is involved in this?
Well, there are a number of independent sort of sources of information, lines of evidence that tell us that this isn't natural, that this is human-caused. Let's look at the big picture, the warming of the planet. A little less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet since pre-industrial time. Now people ask, well, couldn't that happen naturally? Well, it turns out that if you look at the factors that are driving natural changes right now, small but measurable fluctuations in the brightness of the sun, volcanic eruptions, they tell us that Earth should have cooled slightly over the past half century.
Here's what he means. In that yellow line at bottom, NASA has measured a steady decline in heat from the sun since the 1950s. But the red line, the temperature of the Earth, has only increased.
We can only explain that warming when we include the human factor of increased greenhouse gas concentrations, in particular carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels.
Well, the president says about climate change, science doesn't know.
The president doesn't know, and he should know better. He should know that the world's leading scientific organizations, our own U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the national academies of every major industrial nation, every scientific society in the United States that's weighed in on the matter. This is a scientific consensus. There's about as much a scientific consensus about human-caused climate change as there is about gravity.
That's what President Trump heard last month from Wade Crowfoot, head of California's Natural Resources Agency, which includes firefighting.
Because if we ignore that science and sort of put our head in the sand and think it's all about vegetation management, we're not going to succeed together protecting Californians.
Okay, it'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Hey, well, I don't think science knows, actually.
Well, with respect, I think he's wrong and he's on the wrong side of history.
This is the unmasked Wade Crowfoot, who reminded us California emerged from a 5-year drought in 2016.
In that drought, which we call the mega drought, hasn't happened at that level in 1,000 years. We experienced communities in California literally running out of water.
And where California dried out is now the site of the largest single fire in state history, called the Creek Fire.
So that's an existential challenge. We lost over 160 million trees in the Sierra Nevada mountain range as a result of that drought. The fire that burned the hottest and most dangerous, the Creek Fire, was in the epicenter of that tree mortality. It ran so hot that it created a smoke cloud 50,000 feet in the sky.
What was the impact of all the smoke?
So consider this, 50 million Americans on the West Coast suffered through weeks of the worst air quality on the planet.
You didn't have to live anywhere near the fires to be affected by them.
Not at all. Throughout California, the smoke was so bad that our kids couldn't play outside, and folks were discouraged from even spending any time outdoors.
I did my first climate story more than 20 years ago, and I remember at the time being told that there would be terrible fires and terrible hurricanes in 100 years, that this was a problem for our great-grandchildren. What changed?
What we're finding is that many of these changes can happen faster than we thought they could. We didn't really expect to see substantial loss of ice from the 2 major continental ice sheets, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. But now the satellite measurements and in situ measurements tell us that they're already losing ice. They're already beginning that process of collapse. It's already contributing to sea level rise, decades ahead of schedule.
Still, geophysicist Michael Mann told us warming can be stopped. Oceans and forests would begin to absorb excess carbon in a matter of years if emissions, principally from coal-fired power plants, are reduced close to zero. Former NASA scientist James Hansen believes the way to do that is for governments to tax cheap fossil fuels to make them more expensive than clean alternatives.
They have these wishful thinking agreements like Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Every country says, we'll try to do better. That won't work. What we need is to have an increasing price on the fossil fuels and do it in a way that the public will accept.
At what point does it become too late?
It becomes too late if you get to the point that you cannot stop the ice sheet disintegration. That's the biggest point of no return. We can get to a point where we're going to get several meters of sea level rise out of our control. That's too late. We would lose our coastal cities, and more than half of the large cities in the world are on coastlines.
If we don't start to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere, 50 years from now, someone doing research on this time might look at this interview, and I wonder what you would like to say to them.
That's a tough question. I would say we did everything we could, and we're sorry. We're sorry that we failed. But I don't think that's our future. I don't want that to be our future. That's a possible future. We have to recognize that. The worst visions that Hollywood has given us of dystopian futures are real possible futures if we don't act on this problem, the greatest crisis that we face as a civilization.
It's summer in Australia, and it's been a season from hell. Raging fires have devastated the continent, scorching a reported 27 million acres and killing 33 people. Bushfires are a part of life in Australia, and they're often deadly. But the scale of these fires is unprecedented. Areas across multiple states have ignited. Australian cities have suffocated in smoke, on some days giving residents the worst air quality in the world. And according to one estimate, 1 billion animals have been killed. Scientists say climate change is transforming Australia's environment, making it hotter and drier, and exposing it to longer, more intense fire seasons. The fires started unusually early in September, and when we visited the continent this month, we found that Australia is still burning. The fires have devoured forests like rivers of lava. Smoke blanketing the landscape, the skies turning marmalade in the middle of the day. It's been a black summer down under, and it's not over yet. It sometimes feels as if Australia is at war, doing battle with insatiable flames that are fueled by record heat, high winds, and a country parched by drought. And this is what's been left behind in towns like Cobargo, 5 hours south of Sydney, where Marilyn Mills was trapped inside her burning house.
So the fire came up through here, is that right?
It started coming up here, just straight, and I thought, I'm just going to burn to death.
It sounds as if you were convinced that you were going to die.
And I just thought, just die.
You wanted to die at that point?
If I could have killed myself, I would have done it in a second, rather than burn to death. It was so hot. Oh my God!
60 miles away on the coast, the scenes on New Year's Eve were like a modern-day Dunkirk. The fires forced people to retreat to the beaches as flying embers gusted across the sand.
They actually had to jump into the ocean to escape. The fires burnt right to the edge.
Have you ever seen that before? People having to shelter on the beach and in the water?
On a massive scale, over hundreds of miles in multiple communities, no, that's just unprecedented.
Greg Mullins was there, an experienced fire captain battling towering flames.
The wind was howling. When the fire came through, it sounded like a 747 jet landing. So the sounds, the sights, it was apocalyptic. I don't like this. Nah, out.
Mullins says he'd never seen a blaze move that quickly.
At one stage I saw kangaroos come out of the bush on fire and then just drop dead on the roadway, and I've never ever seen that before because they're fast animals, they know where to go.
This time-lapse video from a dashcam shows how firefighters were forced to scramble in the face of rapidly approaching flames. In less than 2 minutes, the fire consumed anything that didn't make it out. Hundreds of bushfires have burned for weeks on end, some of them merging into mega fires. And firefighters on the front line say nature has gone awry.
I saw fire behaviour that I didn't expect, and what I learned later was that the fire had created its own weather system.
What do you mean the fire had created its own weather system?
Big fires can form storm clouds, which then you have an inrush of air at the bottom, you have downbursts, just like a normal thunderstorm. You have lightning that can start fires 20, 25 miles away, and firefighters can lose their lives. So one night, an 8-tonne fire truck was picked up by a downburst and put on its roof and killed a firefighter and injured the rest of them.
To drop fire retardant, Australia is relying on borrowed flying tankers from North America. One of the planes went down in smoky conditions last month, killing 3 American firefighters on board.
We're so indebted to those people, and every firefighter felt it. 3 of our brothers, albeit from the US, lost their lives trying to help us.
Australia's firefighters are nearly all volunteers, courageous but exhausted. They're affectionately known as fireys, and we saw them protecting suburban homes.
This fire is burning out of control, and it's just 25 miles from Canberra, Australia's capital city. And what makes things even more dangerous are the conditions. It's windy today, it's bone dry, and it's nearly 110 degrees.
And it's the changing climate that's at the heart of the problem, according to scientists.
2019 was the hottest and the driest year in Australia's history. So we actually saw temperature records be broken all over the country.
Joelle Gerges is a climate scientist at the Australian National University and is a lead author of an upcoming United Nations report on climate change.
This is the type of summer you might not have expected till the middle of the century based on past projections. So I think this is really redefining what it means to actually be living through a period of rapid climate change.
So you're saying you would have expected this kind of scenario that we saw this summer to happen in 2050?
Yeah, potentially, middle of the century.
Are you shocked?
Of course I'm shocked.
Gerges says Australia is more vulnerable to climate change than any other developed nation, in part because it's the driest inhabited continent.
When it comes to climate change, is Australia a bellwether for the rest of the world?
I think this summer has been a real wake-up call for most Australians. And myself as a climate scientist, seeing the extreme level of heat and the bushfires and the drought conditions playing out so catastrophically has been, I think, a wake-up call to the world.
We have been mugged by the reality of climate change in this summer.
Malcolm Turnbull is a political conservative who served as Australia's Prime Minister up until August of 2018.
This is climate change in the raw. This is what we have been told to expect for years.
When you were Prime Minister, were you warned that the fires were getting worse?
Well, of course. Everyone has known this. We've been warned by the climate scientists. Everyone has been aware of this, except for those who, well, the climate change deniers are aware of it, but they choose to deny reality. It has been a challenging time.
Turnbull was bounced out of office by the right wing of his own party, largely over his support for cutting carbon emissions.
The right-wing climate deniers treat an issue of science and physics and fact as though it was a question of ideology, and their conduct is not just idiotic, it is downright dangerous. Dangerous for us here in Australia and right around the world.
You're talking about people in your own party.
Of course I am, yeah, absolutely.
Dangerous and idiotic.
Well, of course it is dangerous and idiotic not to be taking the strongest action to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions.
Turnbull was replaced by Scott Morrison, who has minimised climate change. He famously stood up in Parliament in 2017 and taunted his opponents with a lump of coal.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. It's coal.
Morrison has prioritised protecting Australia's mining industry. Coal is the country's second largest export. And members of the current government argue it's not Australia's responsibility to act on climate change, since the country only produces about 1% of global emissions.
Isn't there some truth in that? I mean, if the US doesn't act, if China and India don't act to cut emissions, it doesn't matter very much what Australia does.
Well, if we don't act, a wealthy, advanced economy facing the harsh reality of climate change, if we don't act and show leadership, why would anyone else act?
With his country on fire, the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, took his family on a Hawaiian vacation. When he returned home, he was given a cold shoulder as he tried to comfort victims in the fire zones.
We only had 4 trucks to defend our town.
He was heckled by seething residents.
Nah, you're an idiot, mate. You really are.
Including in the hard-hit town of Cobargo, where Marilyn Mills lives.
A lot of people in Cobargo are angry with the Prime Minister. Do you share those feelings?
Well, he didn't like the fire. What can he do? He's just a bloke with a whole bunch of people under him and they're all idiots.
So for you, it sounds like it's the entire government that you're angry with.
Well, they need to have a look at what threatens Australia. Fire threatens Australia. That's our big thing, fire. Fire, drought, all those sorts of things. That's what they need to focus on.
There's been a big
Greg Mullen says he and 22 former fire and emergency service chiefs from all over Australia wrote to Prime Minister Morrison last April, warning him of a looming catastrophe and requesting more resources to fight bushfires.
And what was the response?
That he was too busy to meet with us.
He refused to meet with you?
Point blank. Told us to buzz off, basically.
Why?
We've been told by senior public servants in Canberra that because we uttered 2 horrible words, climate change, we were discounted as being activists and we would not get a meeting at any stage with the Prime Minister.
We wanted to interview the Prime Minister about the devastating fires and their connection with climate change, but he declined our requests, as did other members of his government. Scott Morrison has admitted that he made mistakes in the handling of this crisis, but what he has not done is make any change to reduce this country's carbon emissions.
Climate scientist Joelle Gerges says the future of Australia hangs in the balance.
Are the Australian people being betrayed by their politicians?
At this moment, I think it is really reckless and potentially criminal because we actually know enough about the science now. I think the science is crystal clear and I think the impacts are now playing out. Now, remember that Australia is actually an extraordinary continent. We have the highest level of plants and animals that are found here and nowhere else on Earth.
Australia's most iconic animals, koalas and kangaroos, have fared terribly, innocent victims of the fires. One scientist estimates at least 1 billion animals have died. We went to Kangaroo Island off Australia's southern coast, where tens of thousands of koalas are believed to have been killed. 48% of the island has burned. Surviving koalas have been brought to a makeshift care centre, the living room of a family that runs a wildlife park. The baby koalas, some only months old, receive special attention. Many koalas were singed on their paws and arrived dehydrated. A MASH unit has been set up to sedate them and treat their wounds so they may one day return to their habitat, or what's left of it. Feeding grounds have been reduced to char, and just before we left the island, we came across this hungry kangaroo, scouring the ashes for something to eat. In the last 2 weeks, it's finally rained, giving everyone some respite and hope that this most brutal season of fires may be coming to an end. But the scars remain. In what used to be pristine wilderness, ringing with birdsong and brimming with wildlife, there is silence. The music of the forest, in the middle of the Australian summer, is gone.
Australia is burning, An area about as large as West Virginia has been blackened by the fires, and according to a University of Sydney scientist, it's estimated 1 billion animals have died. The blazes are bigger than the ones that torched California and the Amazon, events that took place on different continents, but are part of the same story: global climate change. It's a story not just of fire, but water. Before climate scientists worried about Australia burning, they warned that Venice, Italy, is drowning. Man's most beautiful artifact, built on millions of pylons in the middle of a lagoon, may be vanishing before our eyes. The periodic floods of Venice have become more threatening and more frequent. This past November, a sudden storm surge overwhelmed nearly 90% of the city. Climate scientists say what happened that night exactly 2 months ago in Venice is a warning to the world of what's to come. And not just in Venice. Ever since the 5th century, Venice has depended on the water for survival. This improbable Italian city, knit together between islands, used water as a barrier against invaders to become a jewel of the world. Then came the night of November 12th. Streets ran like rivers. Squares became swimming pools. It was Venice's second highest tide ever recorded, more than 6 feet above sea level. Wind from a storm barreling up the Adriatic Sea accelerated from 6 miles an hour to 70 in less than 15 minutes. When the surge was over, the destruction totaled $1 billion.
It's enough. And now I say to myself the other night with the water until my almost underpants downstairs, I mean, this is ridiculous. We can't be like this. The power of the water was so strong that...
Toto Bergamo Rossi is known as Venice's unofficial mayor. A descendant of an ancient Venetian family, he is a director of the Venice Heritage Foundation.
I feel like I'm the doctor of this kind of old patient and I have to do it. I have to check, I have to help.
If Venice is a patient, is it time to call the ambulance?
Now I think it's like, how you call that kind of department? They put you the mask and you are...
Oh yeah, the intensive care unit.
Intensive care, exactly. Now we are in intensive care.
Yeah.
Completely.
But it wasn't just one flood. For days in November, Venetians woke to the sound of tones, warning of more record-breaking tides. Venice has always been vulnerable. The city is also slowly sinking. But the water is rising higher and more frequently. 3 of the 8 highest tides in Venice's recorded history occurred just in November. This is becoming the new normal. And waterlogged Venetians wonder how much more this ancient city can take.
The frequency, it's like an earthquake. When there are too many, then it means something is happening. I see it as an opportunity to wake up the world.
Luigi Brugnaro, a conservative and former businessman, is Venice's elected mayor. Are you convinced that the recent water rise, the frequency of the water rise, is the result of man-made climate change?
Yes, of course. Yes, these are the effects of climate change.
These extreme events are damaging many of Venice's masterpieces, like the 900-year-old Basilica of St. Mark, known as the Church of Gold. Its marble floors were swamped on November 12th, and downstairs water buried the crypt for only the second time ever. The water receded but left behind salt, which Italians call the cancer because it eats away at mosaics and foundations. Pierpaolo Campostrini, who helps manage the basilica, pled for his church and his city.
I'm emotional. I'm also a bit angry about this.
Who are you angry at?
It's a fault of my generation. So I don't want to leave to my children this responsibility. My generation should act.
This past November, Venice nearly lost another of its gems.
This is the most beautiful theater all around the world.
At La Fenice, where Verdi debuted his operas La Traviata and Rigoletto, November's flood hit days before the season opener. Once the danger was over, Fortunato Ortombina,
and these,
La Fenice's artistic director, relived the drama of the panic backstage.
Can you imagine this tube with the water coming out like a fountain? It was completely under the water.
And it's never supposed to have any water.
No. If the water arrives on the cable, on the line where you have electricity, it exploded. Yeah. It exploded.
Miraculously, it didn't. And with vacuums running around the clock, the water went down so the curtain could go up. The opening scene from Verdi's Don Carlo, a prayer for the dead.
Venice is facing an existential threat, essentially, to the city as it has been.
You say Venice is dying. Those are the stakes for you.
Those are the stakes, and that's exactly...
Michael Oppenheimer is a professor of geosciences at Princeton University. He was a lead author of a landmark report for the United Nations on climate change that found coastal cities are increasingly at risk from sea level rise. When people look at Venice and what is happening in Venice, more floods, faster and higher, what message should they take for the rest of the world?
Oh, the rest of the world should take the message that this is what the situation is going to look like in many places that they live in. Venice is just, you know, as everybody says, the canary in the coal mine. It's happening there now.
Climate change, Oppenheimer says, is the major reason we'll see more floods for the ages across the globe, like the one that hit Venice 2 months ago.
Sea level is rising almost everywhere on Earth. Not only is sea level rising, the rise is accelerating. It's happening faster and faster.
How much faster is that pace quickened?
So by the year 2050, which is only 30 years into the future, many places around the world, including in the US, are going to experience the historical once-in-a-100-year flood level once a year or more frequently. Let me repeat that. An event that used to cause severe flooding once a century, we're going to get that same water level once a year.
What cities are we talking about?
Places like Los Angeles, San Diego, Key West, Miami, Jacksonville, Savannah, Honolulu.
But at least there's a plan to defend Venice. We headed out to one of the 3 inlets where the tides from the Adriatic Sea flow into the lagoon that surrounds the city. This is where Venetians hope that a controversial project called Moses will part the waters. More than 30 years in the making, Moses is supposed to deploy 78 retractable gates to block exceptional high tides, as this animation illustrates. Construction finally began in 2003, but corruption scandals and engineering challenges have delayed Moses years past its due date. After all the tests are done, when are you saying that Moses will be ready?
It's now planned by the end of 2021.
In a tunnel 60 feet below sea level, we met Alessandro Soru, the project's lead engineer. So how many days a year was it planned that Moses would be used?
Say an average of 10 days a year.
But the fear is if the Adriatic continues to rise past projections, the Moses gates may have to be raised nearly every day by the middle of this century. It was not designed for that kind of wear and tear. The worst flood in Venice's history happened in 1966. It was only a few inches higher than this past November's. Back in '66, experts said the flood was a once-in-800-year event. Nonetheless, thousands of Venetians left for good.
It really was the major historic turning point in the recent history of the city. And we thought that something like that would not happen again.
Shaul Bossi is a product of that flood. A professor of English literature at Venice's Ca' Foscari University, his parents met when his mother went to Venice to help the flood victims. They stayed, but how many will now that the seasonal high tides known as acqua altas are getting worse? Explain how it was different this time from previous acqua altas.
So I think that people now feel far more vulnerable. We're hearing the sirens now. Acqua alta is coming back. You see, this is what's happening. It's happening every day now. It's never happened like that. You know, it happens 1, 2, 3 days. Now it's like over a week that every day we have that. This is new.
When you hear the sirens, does that take you back?
And so now it really makes me feel very nervous.
During our 8 days in Venice, we found the city on edge because the water keeps defeating the accommodations residents have already made to it.
The real threat, as far as I'm concerned, is that they may actually push even more people away and would live the city as a kind of ghost town or as a beautiful empty museum.
The ground floors in this stooped and shrinking city have already been abandoned. Life is lived on the first story and above. Artisans like Saverio Pastor, one of the last who patiently crafts oarlocks for the city's gondolas, are becoming scarce. While residents weigh moving out, the tourists keep marching in, donning neon booties and learning to walk on water, or in single file on the hastily assembled footbridges that lace through what may be a doomed city. To give Venice a future, its mayor wants to turn the city into a world laboratory to combat climate change.
Facciamolo qua. Why don't we do it here? Let's do it here. Let's study it here.
E facciamolo sull'acqua.
Let's study the water. Let's study the pollution, the rising waters, the temperature.
Proprio un esempio.
It could be an example of great mobilization at a world level.
Is the message to the rest of the world, if you don't save Venice, it will happen to you next?
Io non voglio preoccupare nessuno.
I don't want to worry anybody, but I think I'd like a different message. Let's save Venice to save the world.
Venice has survived before. Every November, Venetians flock to the Santa Maria della Salute church, which was built to commemorate the end of the 17th century plague that killed 50,000 citizens. This year's ceremony in the wake of the flood had a special resonance.
The festival is a festival about survival.
Was it more well attended this year than it would have been in the past?
Absolutely. I think that it was more heartfelt. I think a lot of people this time felt, this might not be there forever. I think this is what has perhaps changed, that a lot of us are feeling, well, we cannot take this for granted.
What would be lost is a city where so much of the art interprets the natural beauty of light that arrives twice a day, once from the sun and once as it is reflected back off the water. But Venice is no longer just something beautiful to look at. Its fragility is a warning to the rest of the planet that this ancient city is under pressures from forces it cannot control. Venice is not alone. In a world of warming temperatures and sea level rise, no place is an island.
This past week, California declared a statewide drought emergency. It follows the first ever federal shortage declaration on the Colorado River, triggering cuts to water supplies in the Southwest. The Colorado is the lifeblood of the region. It waters some of the country's fastest-growing cities, nourishes some of our most fertile fields, and powers $1.4 trillion in annual economic activity. The river runs more than 1,400 miles, from headwaters in the Rockies to its delta in northern Mexico, where it ends in a trickle. 7 states and 30 Native American tribes lie in the Colorado River basin. Lately, the river has been running dry due to the historically severe drought. The majestic, meandering Colorado River that cut through these red cliffs carving the Grand Canyon is a wonder of nature and human ingenuity. The Glen Canyon Dam created Lake Powell, and 300 miles downriver, Lake Mead sits behind the Hoover Dam. These reservoirs are now being sucked dry by 40 million different straws. That's the number of people in booming western states who depend on the Colorado to quench their thirst, power their homes, water lawns, and splash in the sun. Its waters irrigate farms that produce 90% of the country's winter greens. To all these demands, add the stress of a 22-year drought, as dry as any period in 1,200 years, and you have a river in crisis.
These white bathtub rings, is this where the water used to be? Absolutely.
Brad Udall, a climate scientist at Colorado State University, went out on Lake Powell with us.
So all of this would have been underwater?
Yeah.
So what does this tell you about what's happening on the Colorado River?
Well, it's a signal of the long-term problem we've been seeing since the year 2000, which is climate change is reducing the flows of the Colorado significantly.
Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the 2 biggest reservoirs in the country, were nearly full in 2000. Today, they are at just about 30% capacity.
The lake's now 155 feet below full. It's dropped something like 50 feet this year.
And it's still dropping?
Yes. And that's when power generation actually becomes to come into question.
It'll drop so low that it may not be able to
It
generate
may not be able to generate power.
hydroelectric power.
Yeah.
Brad Udall has strong connections to the river. As Secretary of the Interior, his uncle, Stuart Udall, opened the Glen Canyon Dam. His father, Congressman Mo Udall, fought to channel river water to Arizona.
100 yards.
As a young man, Brad was a Colorado River guide. Today, he analyzes the impact of climate change on water resources.
Is the West on a collision course with climate change?
In some ways, yes, but we have fully utilized this system. We've overallocated it, and we now need to think about how to turn some of this back. Because the only lever we control right now in the river is the demand lever. We have no control over the supply. So we have to dial back demand.
70% of Colorado River water goes to agriculture. When the federal government declared the water shortage, it triggered mandatory cutbacks. Pinal County, Arizona got hit hard.
Pinal County alone, we're going to be losing 300,000 acre feet of surface water. That's water that would be delivered from Lake Powell, Lake Mead, as part of the Colorado River. 300,000 acre feet is 98 billion gallons of water.
Waylon Wirtz farms 500 acres in Pinal County, south of Phoenix. His family has tilled soil here for 4 generations. It's some of the most productive land in the state. Crops from Pinal County are shipped all over the country. Wirtz grows gourds, cotton, and alfalfa. Profitable but thirsty crops, and his allotment of Colorado River water is being cut by 70%.
This is Colorado River water?
Yep, kind of the lifeline of our irrigated ag here.
This comes straight in from Lake Mead?
Correct. This is through hundreds of miles of canal system. It's made its way down here to central Arizona.
And what percentage of your water is supplied by this canal?
It's been close to 50% of the water that we've used to farm here. And this next year, it's probably going to drop down to about 20% of the water that we use.
That's 1/7 of what he was getting a decade ago. To use less water and make ends meet, Wirtz sold more than 300 acres to a solar farm. He dipped into retirement funds to repair and restart old wells. He laser leveled his fields to make irrigation more efficient.
But it's just not enough in the middle of this drought.
No, it's not enough.
So next year, he told us, he'll have to leave 150 acres uncultivated.
What you see green here is eventually going to die. I hope we'll have enough water to plant it in the future, but more than likely it's going to stay brown for quite some time.
All the water users are going to have to give up something to keep that water in the lake.
Amelia Flores is chairwoman of the Colorado River Indian Tribes, a reservation of 4 tribes a few hours west of Phoenix, with the oldest and largest water rights in Arizona. After being moved to reservations, Southwest tribes got rights to about 1/4 of the river's flow, but government red tape and lack of infrastructure have prevented them from using their full allotment. Flores told us until this drought, tribes were never included in water negotiations.
Why had you not had a seat at the table before this?
Because the tribes have always been overlooked in the policy making and in the law of the river, but that day has come to an end.
When Western states first divvied up the Colorado River in 1922, and later when the federal government built the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, the future seemed boundless and manageable. Through negotiation and court battles, states worked out agreements, the law of the river, to split the water equally between upper and lower basin states. The lower states used just about all their allotment, and it's fed their tremendous growth. The upper states have never used their full share. Now they are booming and say they need the water they've been promised.
I can see the bathtub rings around here, too.
We're trying to keep every drop of water we can into this reservoir for next year's drinking water.
Zach Renstrom manages the water system for Washington County in southwest Utah. St. George, the county seat, is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the U.S. Its population grew 29% this past decade. The state of Utah gets about a quarter of its water from the Colorado, but most of Washington County has only one source, the Virgin River, which fills this reservoir.
So right now, we're in the process of implementing really strict conservation measures. And if the cities don't adopt those standards, then we'll be out of water very quickly.
What is very quickly?
Within the next 5 to 10 years.
So in the midst of this drought, Utah is proposing to build a $1 to $2 billion pipeline able to bring 27 billion gallons of water a year from dwindling Lake Powell. Utah says it's entitled to the water by law.
You're talking about siphoning off water from a lake that's already at a critically low level to help a city grow in the desert.
Every state on the Colorado River was allotted so much water and a water budget. And so with their water budget, the state of Utah has decided that it wants to use a portion of its water here in St. George, Utah.
But it was a budget that was set when water was plentiful. It isn't anymore. What is Utah hoping for?
Utah wants the right to do what every other basin state has done. We want to make sure that we have water for our future, for a hotter, drier scenario that's coming up.
Building a multi-billion-dollar pipeline to pump out more water from an already rapidly declining reservoir simply doesn't make sense in the 21st century.
J.B. Hamby is vice president of the board that runs California's Imperial Irrigation District, one of the richest agricultural regions in the country, with the single largest allocation of water on the entire river.
There's a lot of urban growth and sprawl occurring in other parts of the Colorado River Basin that's really not necessarily sustainable.
Hamby says California's Imperial Valley farms have cut water usage almost 20% since 2003, but points out as the population of St. George, Utah grows, so does its water use.
We need to think and rethink about how we grow and if we grow and where we grow.
St. George would say that they're not asking for more, they're asking for what they need.
I think what we all need to have is a reality check here and recognize that we live in an era of limits right now, and that's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's only going to get worse.
A big part of the problem is the law of the river itself, a hodgepodge of rules and regulations pieced together over the course of a century. For example, after all the litigation and negotiations, the law ends up allocating more water than actually flows down the Colorado. And this, in times of shortage, channels that provide more than a third of Arizona's water must run dry before California is required to cut back.
So wait a minute. Arizona is being called on to cut its water intake before California has to give up even one drop.
Pretty amazing. It can't work in today's world. And it's in some ways a little microcosm, right, of this whole law of the river with these systems that have been put in place that just don't work. They can't work. And that's why a rethink's needed.
One example of rethinking, the Colorado River Indian tribes agreed to leave fields uncultivated, leaving 48 billion gallons, almost 3 feet of water in Lake Mead. The state of Arizona agreed to pay them for their losses.
My people want to help during this drought. We want to save the river because for centuries, the river has always taken care of us. So now we have to take care of the river.
That's what negotiations are all about, right? It may be there ways to conserve and figure out how to get the same goods and services for less water. Let's let ag grow crops that use less water. Let's figure out how to make cities use water as efficiently as possible. So, I mean, we need some optimism here, right?
Desert ground.
But as we saw at this meeting of Pinal County farmers, optimism is in short supply.
The farmer who's prepared the whole life, worked the land, farmed the land, is getting the short end of the stick.
Farmers here and across the Southwest feed the country. but it takes more than 2/3 of the Colorado River to produce the bounty. With lake levels dropping, Arizona farmers like Waylon Wirtz fear their fertile fields could become desert again.
You're going to see drastic cuts, a drastic change of what next year has to bring. And for my particular family farm, we're doing all that we can to keep it going. But I have a feeling it's just a matter of time before none of this exists.
What are the signs of global warming? Glaciers are melting at an increasingly rapid pace. Persistent droughts are spreading. Well, we have another to tell you about, wine, as in what you probably cracked open for Christmas dinner. Farmers who grow the grapes have seen the effects of climate change in the soil, in the roots of the vines, and the yields of their crops. France, a major center of winemaking for centuries, is experiencing increasingly higher temperatures and extreme weather conditions that have damaged vintages and livelihoods. This year was particularly dramatic. France recorded its smallest harvest since 1957 and stands to lose more than $2 billion in sales, a huge blow to the country's second largest export industry. And it's hitting nearly all the wine-growing regions where they make dry whites, fruity reds, and fizzy champagne. All bubblies are called sparkling wine, but champagne is made here and nowhere else in these vineyards and villages of Champagne located in northeastern France. There's a mystique to champagne, an aura of romance. Coco Chanel once said, "I only drink champagne on 2 occasions, when I'm in love and when I'm not." They've been producing this wine of kings here for centuries. So how long has this winemaking business and the vineyards been in your family?
From 1700.
1700?
Yes.
Christine Sevillano took over the family business and its 20 acres of vines 14 years ago. She's the 10th generation.
This is the cellar of my grandfather.
Oh. After surviving the French Revolution and 2 world wars, her family's house of Pio Sevillano faced its worst year ever in 2021.
We lost 90% of our harvest.
90%?
Yes.
How many bottles were you able to produce this year, as opposed to a normal year?
A normal year, I produce around 50,000 bottles.
This year?
0. It's the first time in the history of my winery that we will not make champagne.
Not a single bottle from this winery?
Yes.
Higher temperatures and extreme weather episodes devastated not only her harvest, but much of Champagne's.
It rained in 2 or 3 days that it rained normally in 1 month. Even my father told me that in his career, he has never seen that.
Almost flood-like?
Yes.
The worst of it, she says, came in June and July, when the heat and the rains resulted in a more crippling outbreak than usual of funguses, like mildew contamination.
In fact, when the grapes are contaminated, the fruit is drying, and after we can use it because there is no juice, nothing.
And you attribute this to climate change?
Yes, because it was so extreme. It's not normal.
This year's extreme weather not only battered Champagne and the foundation of its economy, but nearly every one of the wine-producing regions in France, Burgundy to Bordeaux, where some of the highest quality, best known, and best tasting reds and whites are made. And these are what grape? What?
This is Merlot.
Merlot.
Yes.
I love Merlot.
Yeah, Merlot makes a beautiful, soft, rounded wines.
Jacques Lerton, the head of a wine family dynasty, runs the Chateau La Louvière and several other wineries in Bordeaux. He says vine disease is getting worse all over France because of the rising temperatures.
We don't have winters anymore, almost. In wintertime, normally you get colder conditions. These cool conditions tend to kill the funguses or the disease. So normally, winter cleans the situation, you see. But the most important problem that we have is what we call spring frost.
Spring frost was so severe in April this year that wine growers were on their knees lighting bales of hay and candles between their vines in a mostly futile attempt to protect their young buds.
It is the largest catastrophe we have ever suffered, because before we had some spring frost in some regions, but this is the first time we have it all over France. Now, due to the fact that we don't have these very strong winters, the buds start to open and then expose themselves to this series of spring frost that we have.
And that is the crux
of... And this is what affects the most the quantity of grapes.
So tell us about this year in terms of the amount.
In average, in France this year, a loss of 30%.
30% of the yields. And what about you? What's your percentage?
We have been affected up to 40%.
So you're one of the largest wine producers in Bordeaux. 40% loss, I mean, that's enormous.
It's huge. It's huge.
For Bordeaux, he estimates a loss of roughly $800 million in sales this year. Is this something that's happening all over Europe or just France?
No, it's happening all over Europe, definitely.
Greg Jones is a research climatologist with Southern Oregon University, who for 25 years has specialized in the study of how climate influences the growing and harvesting of wine grapes.
What we're seeing today is we're seeing more of these extreme events happening more frequently at greater degrees and causing more problems.
Yeah, we see it everywhere. It's not just in farm regions. I mean, every part of our country is experiencing some extreme weather condition. So how do you know it isn't that normal extreme weather as opposed to a general climate change?
There's an area in climate science called attribution science, and attribution science is all about trying to kind of understand how much role humans have in the game of climate. So the idea of
who to attribute it to.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And so what climatologists do is we develop models that look at aspects of climate, and those models that are coming out are really telling us more and more that in the absence of humans, most of these things would not occur to the same degree they're occurring today.
Tie what you're saying about climate to what's going on in France now.
Sure. In France, just like most of Europe, temperatures have gone up, summers have gotten drier, and wine grapes are just sensitive. They're sensitive to those kind of changes, and we've been seeing it worldwide, and Europe has been at the epicenter of it.
This weather map of Europe for June 2021, the second warmest June in Europe on record, shows a red band depicting high surface air temperatures stretching across much of the continent. Heat waves were also recorded over western North America in June 2021. Scorching temperatures and drought conditions contributed to wildfires in 2020 around Napa and Sonoma, the center of America's wine industry, where fields were left blackened. In Australia, the bushfires of 2019 and 20 burnt some vineyards to the ground, while smoke ruined the quality of the grapes. In 2017, in Italy, spring frost combined with hailstorms and a heat wave known as Lucifer led to the lowest harvest in decades. Particularly hard hit was northern and central Italy, where Prosecco, Barolo, and Chianti are made. And in parts of Chile and Argentina, higher temperatures are pushing wine growers to plant their vineyards at higher altitudes, where temperatures are cooler. Greg Jones says the warming atmosphere is also changing the grape's growth cycle.
It accelerates that ripening to the point that we're picking earlier. For example, 2020 in Burgundy, the picking date was August 20th. And prior to that, we've been averaging for the last 30 years about September 15th. And then for 600 years before that, we were averaging the end of September, 1st of October.
Oh, so it's dramatic.
So it's pretty dramatic.
These pages of parchment, documenting harvest dates going back as far as 1354, were found in the Church of Notre Dame in Burgundy.
1354.
It's a wonderful data record that we've been able to look at to better understand what climates were like back then, how it affected harvests, and what that looks like today.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking 1300s. I'm thinking the monks were making wine.
Well, exactly.
The wine industry in France is so vital to the economy that the government has scientists studying ways to adapt and mitigate the changing environment. One route to adaptation is to introduce new grape varieties. Experimental vineyards have been planted with vines from warmer climate countries to see if they can grow here so the grapes can be blended in with the Merlots, Cabernets, and other French wines. Nathalie Ola is the director of the project at the Bordeaux Science Institute of Vine and Wine.
So you're looking at grapes that come from southern regions that maybe grow better in warmer climates.
Yes.
Like from where?
From Spain, from Portugal, from Greece.
How many are you actually looking at?
So in this experimental vineyard, we are studying 52 different varieties.
They've chosen 6 of those varieties thus far to be planted in Bordeaux.
So this is your greenhouse?
Yes, it is.
A second route of adaptation is genetic breeding.
Are you actually creating new grapes, new different kinds of grapes?
Yes, the idea is to have grapes, new varieties, which can be resistant to disease and also more adapted to climate change conditions.
And do not compromise the distinctive qualities of the French wines. At the Institute's laboratory, scientists are studying the genetics of wine's color, aroma, and taste.
And that's what you're trying to preserve, even as you introduce new grapes.
Yes, I think we want to change without changing, I would say.
Yes. How confident are you that you're going to crack the puzzle? You're going to figure out how to stay ahead of climate change?
All together, with new varieties, new growing practice, I think we can cope with climate change, at least until the middle of the 21st century.
The middle of the century is only 30 years from now.
Yeah.
So you're looking at how fast temperatures are rising, and you're saying it's possible that they will rise above a point.
That it will be much more complicated to keep what we call Bordeaux style and Bordeaux taste.
With all the gloom and doom about warming temperatures in wine country, there's actually a surprising upside.
What about quality? What about the taste? What's important about wine? How is climate change affecting that?
Alors, the climate change is affecting the quality very positively.
Positively?
Yes, exactly. We have never seen such a large quantity of good vintages of Bordeaux wines.
Well, explain that. That's counterintuitive.
Thanks to the global warming and the climate change, now we have warmer summers, and which makes that our grapes are ripening better. If we get good warm conditions, we have good color quantity in the skin, but as well, we have the right amount of sugar.
What a painful irony. The taste improves just as the yields are shrinking for winemakers like Christine Sevillano.
So more quality, but fewer grapes, dramatically fewer grapes.
Yes, it's crazy.
If you have another year like this one, financially, can you survive?
It will be difficult, really, really difficult. But in the same time, I'm trustful for next year. I mean, I'm trustful. I have to.
Improved taste is not the only unforeseen benefit of climate change for some winemakers. How it's affecting the bubbly you're likely to enjoy on New Year's Eve when we return. For some wine growers, climate change has been a disaster, as we've seen. But as it turns out, climate change has been a boon for others. While higher temperatures have hurt growers in France and Italy, for instance, places that historically have been too cold to produce quality wines are now turning out consistently good ones. Places like England. The notion that in England the only beverage is lukewarm ale at the pub is woefully outdated. Today, a new industry has taken root. Healthy vineyards in England are producing some of the world's best wines. This sprawling vineyard, with acres and acres of wine grapes ready for harvest, is located in Kent, 40 miles outside of London. It didn't exist 15 years ago, but Great Britain's wine-producing fortunes have been heating up along with the planet. So how has climate change affected the grapes, the wine in this region?
Well, it's completely revolutionized it because...
Stephen Skelton, a member of the highly respected Institute of Masters of Wine, is a viticulturist, an expert in the science, production, and business of wine grapes. I never heard of really good English wine.
No, well, it was very, very rare until we realized that you could grow these classic French champagne varieties in our climate.
This is what they grow in Champagne?
Yeah, and they now grow very, very successfully here in the UK.
What used to be a minute cottage industry run by retirees and gentlemen farmers is today one of the fastest wine-growing regions in the world. This is quite an operation going on.
Oh, it's a big winery.
In 2018, the vintage in England was so bountiful that some vineyards had to scramble to buy vats and tanks to hold it all. Others simply threw grapes away. By the end of the decade, winemakers here will produce an estimated 20 million bottles a year.
No, the foundation of today's industry is the fact that we can grow these varieties which we couldn't grow earlier.
So why couldn't you do it before?
Because the climate was too cold.
You just had to get the temperature up.
Yeah.
So does global warming mean that England now has more days for the grapes to ripen?
Yeah, because we have more days over 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, we are in the UK now. We're now where Champagne was 30 or 40 years ago. The climate has shifted in 30 or 40 years upwards, northwards.
So the climate right now, where you and I are sitting in England, is the same as the climate was 40 years ago in
Champagne.
France.
In Champagne, yeah.
He traces the birth of the industry here to 1988.
Then there came two Americans, the Mosses, Stuart and Sandy Moss. They bought an estate called Nye Timber, which is very well known today, and they were the first people to plant a big commercial vineyard.
What did you think?
I thought they were bonkers. I have to say, yeah, I thought they were nuts. I'd heard they were rich Americans up in the hills. He had a fortune apparently from the dental business. And I thought they were mad. Their first wine took a long while to mature. It was 4 years in the making before it was tasted. And then it won this major prize.
Right away, 4 years?
Yeah. And the next year, they won an even bigger prize.
Are you thinking that in a couple of years, the English sparkling wine will be actually better than what they're growing in Champagne?
As they produce 300 million bottles a year. The best is still very, very good. The best is superb. But you could line up the best 10 English sparkling wines against the best 10 champagnes at the same sort of price category. I can guarantee you that English wines would be in the top half.
To prove his point, he gave us a taste, opening a 10-year-old bottle.
We're going to open it professionally.
Oh, no pop.
No pop.
Look at that.
The longer sparkling wine ages, he says, the better. And what you look for is the spritz of fizz on the palate.
You see you've got the bubbles coming from there?
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, you see they're nice and small. And then you nose it. You get a nice yeasty character, baking bread, brioche as we call it. And that's a gorgeous, gorgeous bottle of wine.
Winston Churchill once said, "I could not live without champagne. In victory, I deserve it. In defeat, I need it." Well, nothing would have pleased him more than to hear that because English bubbly is now so good, the House of Taittinger, one of the most prestigious of French champagne makers, is in England. It's now growing 120 acres of grapes and is making sparkling wine near Canterbury in what's known as the Garden of England. Patrick McGrath, who represents Taittinger in Great Britain, persuaded the company to invest here in 2015.
Have you brought the grapes from France?
Yeah, the vines were imported from France as tiny little vines. And the first crop we had from them was in 2020. And then that wine will be released at the end of 2024.
You know, in France, part of the problem is not just warming. It's extreme weather conditions. You know, too much flooding, too much frost, too hot. Won't England also have extreme situations like that?
Not at the moment. We're fortunate. You know, England is coming onto the radar as being an area that is warming, but is still moderate in terms of heat compared to South and Central Europe, where it's becoming very, very hot.
Do you think that wine lovers around the world already know that great wines are coming out of England? In other words, is it ooh la la, no more, it's jolly good?
I think we're still at the sort of in the starting block, but certainly yes. Over the last 10 years, from a small base, the sales of English have been growing substantially.
Taittinger's aim is to produce 300,000 bottles a year by 2025. Overall, the English wine industry had $220 million in sales last year. The idea of first-rate English wine would have been laughed at 20 years ago. But a similar migration has happened on the west coast of the United States, where excellent and increasingly popular Pinot and Chardonnay grapes are now found 560 miles north of Napa in Willamette Valley, Oregon.
In the 1950s and 60s, there were really almost no grapes grown in Oregon. And that was because the climates were too cold. And so if you fast forward to where we are today, we're just in a different world.
Greg Jones, a wine climatologist at Southern Oregon University, says grapes are now growing in even more unexpected places.
We have wineries today in Norway, in Quebec, in British Columbia, in Tasmania, and the South Islands of Chile.
Tasmanian wine.
Yeah, Tasmania has really been burgeoning as really a great wine-producing region in Australia.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Tasmania is south of Australia.
Sure.
So as winemaking goes north in the northern hemisphere, are you saying it's going south?
South, yes. Yeah.
In the southern hemisphere? So
yeah, it's going further poleward in both hemispheres, in parts of southern Argentina and Chile, and many parts of northern Europe have started growing grapes.
In real time?
In real time.
In real time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you really want a very vivid now example of what's happening due to climate change, go look at wine.
Yeah, you can. People are experimenting at northerly latitudes that I'm amazed that in my career I didn't think I would see it.
In the United Kingdom, as a measure of its acceptance, English sparkling wine has had the royal imprimatur, the Queen serving it at Buckingham Palace. And it was poured at the recent climate change summit in Scotland. Master of Wine Stephen Skelton is bullish on the future.
If global warming is intensifying, how worried are you and the other English vintners that it's going to move north beyond your ability to grow
No, I'm
grapes?
not worried at all. No, I mean, the next 40 years are going to be fascinating, I think, because, we're just on the cusp of it being really commercial. Our yield levels are not quite where we want them yet. We would like a little bit more heat.
You might get it.
Yeah.
But eventually...
Who knows? We'll have to start growing oranges and bananas.
I mean, it's a serious question.
Yeah. Personally, I think we will cope with what's being thrown at us.
Some of the winemakers we met are benefiting. Some are suffering. But all are seeing firsthand the message that climate change is delivering.
Wine grapes have often been called the canary in the coal mine.
Climatologist Greg Jones says that's been true since the first wine was made in 6000 BC in Eastern Europe and then spread to ancient Egypt, Greece, and Persia. Kings celebrated their victories with wine, and the Christian world put it at the heart of the Eucharist. Wine history, Jones says, is human history.
Wine touches society in some pretty powerful ways. It's related to civilizations, it's related to history, it's related to geography, it's related to romanticism, art, gastronomy, biology, chemistry. So there's so many things that are tied to it that it becomes something that we can tell the story of climate change through wine pretty easily.
In what year will the human population grow too large for the Earth to sustain? And the answer is about 1970, according to research by the World Wildlife Fund. In 1970, the planet's 3.5 billion people were sustainable. But on this New Year's Day, the population is 8 billion. Today, wild plants and animals are running out of places to live. The scientists you're about to meet say the Earth is suffering a crisis of mass extinction on a scale unseen since the dinosaurs. We're going to show you a possible solution, but first, have a look at how humanity is already suffering from the vanishing wild. In Washington state, the Salish Sea helped feed the world.
With this weather and the way things feel once I get out here, it's time to be fishing. That's what it feels like.
Commercial fisherman Dana Wilson supported a family on the Salish Sea's legendary wealth of salmon. He remembers propellers churning the water off Blaine, Washington, and cranes straining for the state's $200 million annual catch.
That used to be a buying station. They're gone now. They don't buy anymore. So that building over there used to buy salmon. They don't buy salmon anymore. It's just not here.
In 1991, one salmon species was endangered. Today, 14 salmon populations are foundering. They've been crowded out of rivers by habitat destruction, warming, and pollution. Dana Wilson used to fish all summer. Today, a conservation authority grants rare, fleeting permission to throw a net.
There was a season.
There was a season.
Now there's a day.
There's a day, sometimes it's hours. Sometimes you might get 12 hours, 16 hours. That's what we're down to.
Here, the vanishing wild scuttled a way of life that began with native tribes 1,000 years ago.
I don't remember anybody doing anything other than salmon fishing.
Fisherman Armando Briones is a member of the Lummi tribe, which calls itself People of the Salmon. He didn't imagine the rich harvest would end with his 5 fishing boats.
All of a sudden, you're trying to figure out, well, how am I going to make that paycheck for my family? Well, for me, it was like, well, I have a backup for a backup for a backup for a backup.
Briones' backups include his new food truck, switching to crab fishing, and consulting on cannabis farms. His scramble to adapt is being repeated around the world. A World Wildlife Fund study says that in the past 50 years, the abundance of global wildlife has collapsed 69%, mostly for the same reason.
Too many people, too much consumption, and growth mania.
At the age of 90, biologist Paul Ehrlich may have lived long enough to see some of his dire prophecies come true.
You seem to be saying that humanity is not sustainable.
No, humanity is not sustainable. To maintain our lifestyle, yours and mine, basically, for the entire planet, you'd need 5 more Earths. Not clear where they're going to come from.
Just in terms of the resources that would be required.
Resources that would be required, the systems that support our lives, which of course are the biodiversity that we're wiping out. Humanity is very busily sitting on a limb that we're sawing off.
In 1968, Ehrlich, a biology professor at Stanford, became a doomsday celebrity with a bestseller forecasting the collapse of nature.
When the population bomb came out, you were described as an alarmist.
I was alarmed. I am still alarmed. All of my colleagues are alarmed.
The alarm Ehrlich sounded in '68 warned that overpopulation would trigger widespread famine. He was wrong about that. The Green Revolution fed the world. But he also wrote in '68 that heat from greenhouse gases would melt polar ice, and humanity would overwhelm the wild. Today, humans have taken over 70% of the planet's land and 70% of the fresh water.
The rate of extinction is extraordinarily high now and getting higher all the time.
We know the rate of extinction is extraordinarily high because of a study of the fossil record by biologist Tony Barnofsky, Ehrlich's Stanford colleague.
The data are rock solid. I don't think you'll find a scientist that will say we're not in an extinction crisis.
Barnofsky's research suggests today's rate of extinction is up to 100 times faster than is typical in the nearly 4 billion year history of life. These peaks represent the few times that life collapsed globally, and the last was the dinosaurs, 66 million years ago.
There are 5 times in Earth's history where we had mass extinctions, and by mass extinctions I mean at least 75%, 3/4 of the known species disappearing from the face of the Earth. Now we're witnessing what a lot of people are calling the 6th mass extinction, where the same thing could happen on our watch.
It's a horrific state of the planet when common species, the ubiquitous species that we're familiar with, are declining.
Tony Barnofsky's colleague in the study of extinction is his wife, biologist Liz Hadley, faculty director at Stanford's Jasper Ridge Research Preserve in California.
You know, I see it in my mind, and it's a really sad state. If you spend any time in California, you know the loss of water. The loss of water means that there are dead salmon you see in the river right before your eyes. But it also means the demise of those birds that rely on the salmon fishery, eagles. It means, things like minks and otters that rely on fish. It means that our habitats that we're used to, the forests that, 3,000-year-old forests, are going to be gone. So it means silence, and it means some very catastrophic events because it's happening so quickly.
It means you look out your window and 3/4 of what you think ought to be there is no longer there. That's what mass extinction looks like.
What we see just in California is, the loss of our iconic state symbols. We have no more grizzly bears in California.
The only grizzly bears in California are on the state flag?
That's our state mammal, and they're not here anymore.
Is it too much to say that we're killing the planet?
No.
I would say it's too much to say that we're killing the planet, because the planet's going to be fine. What we're doing is we're killing our way of life.
The worst of the killing is in Latin America, where the World Wildlife Fund study says the abundance of wildlife has fallen 94% since 1970. But it was also in Latin America that we found the possibility of hope. Mexican ecologist Gerardo Ceballos is one of the world's leading scientists on extinction. He told us the only solution is to save the 1/3 of the Earth that remains wild. To prove it, he's running a 3,000 square mile experiment. In the Calakmul Biosphere Reserve near Guatemala, he is paying family farmers to stop cutting the forest.
We're going to pay each family a certain amount of money that is more than you will get cutting down the forest if you protect it.
And how much are you paying out every year?
For instance, each family here will get around $1,000.
More than enough here to make up for lost farmland. In total, the payouts come to $1.5 million a year, or about $2,000 per square mile. The tab is paid through the charity of wealthy donors.
The investment to protect what is left is, really small.
The payoff on that investment is being collected on Ceballos' jungle cameras. 30 years ago, the jaguar was very nearly extinct in Mexico. Now Ceballos says they've rebounded to about 600 in the reserve.
There are other places where there are reserves around the world where they've been able to increase the populations of certain species. But I wonder, are all these little success stories enough to prevent mass extinction?
All the big success that we have in protecting forests and recovering animals like tigers in India, jaguars in Mexico, elephants in Botswana, and so on, are incredible, amazing successes. But there are like grains of sand in a beach. And to really make a big impact, we need to scale up this 10,000 times. So they are important because they give us hope, but they are completely insufficient to cope with climate change.
So what would the world have to do?
What we would have to do is to really understand that the climate change and species extinction is a threat to humanity, and then put all the machinery of society, political, economic, and social, towards finding solutions to the problems.
Finding solutions to the problems was the goal 2 weeks ago at the UN Biodiversity Conference, where nations agreed to conservation targets. But at the same meeting in 2010, those nations agreed to limit the destruction of the Earth by 2020, and not one of those goals was met. This despite thousands of studies, including the continuing research of Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich. You know that there is no political will to do any of the things that you're recommending.
I know there's no political will to do any of the things that I'm concerned with, which is exactly why I and the vast majority of my colleagues think we've had it, that the next few decades will be the end of the kind of civilization we're used to.
In the 50 years since Ehrlich's population bomb, humanity's feasting on resources has tripled. We're already consuming 175% of what the Earth can regenerate. And consider, half of humanity, about 4 billion, live on less than $10 a day. They aspire to cars, air conditioning, and a rich diet. But they won't be fed by the fishermen of Washington's Salish Sea, including Armando Briones. The tribe has been fishing salmon here for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And your generation is seeing the end of that.
It's getting harder and harder. I hate to say, I don't want to say it's the end of it.
Why do you feel so emotionally attached to this?
It's everything we know. I'm fortunate enough to know where I know a lot of different things. I've done a lot of different things in my life. I've gotten good at evolving and changing. But not everybody here is built like that. And to some of us, this is what they know. This is all they know.
The 5 mass extinctions of the ancient past were caused by natural calamities, volcanoes, and an asteroid. Today, if the science is right, humanity may have to survive a 6th mass extinction in a world of its own making.
Representatives from nearly every nation have met this week at an annual climate summit, searching for agreements on how to curb the rise of global temperatures. The summit is being held in the oil-rich United Arab Emirates, and that has dismayed activists who believe that the only way to really address the climate crisis is to walk away from fossil fuels. For the moment, at least, the world and the United States need both fossil fuels and renewable energy, and the best proof of that may be found in the state of Wyoming. It is the country's leading coal-producing state and very conservative politically, yet its Republican governor, Mark Gordon, is emerging as a leading voice promoting climate-friendly energy projects and action to address the climate crisis. Essentially, Mark Gordon is trying to prove that it is possible to be both red and green.
We needed to be aggressive, and we needed to really address this issue.
So you tell the people of Wyoming that climate change is real.
I do.
And that it's urgent. It's an urgent crisis.
I have said that. And I've gotten some pushback from that as well.
I bet you have. In September, we met Mark Gordon, who's in the middle of his second term as Wyoming's governor.
How are you, Ellington?
On the cattle ranch where he grew up.
This is my dad's old saddle.
His family still owns this ranch, and he and his wife also operate another about 40 miles away.
How did growing up here affect your worldview? I think growing up here gave me an enormous appreciation for the world around us and the ecological processes and the weather. You just are exposed to it on a regular basis.
Mark Gordon is also a mountain climber who has seen glaciers receding due to a warming climate. He says that helped convince him to set a goal of making Wyoming not just carbon neutral when it comes to CO2 emissions, but eventually carbon negative.
You first made this pledge of net negative CO2 emissions at a 2021 State of the State speech. How did that go over?
I think some people probably resented it. I think generally it's been well respected. It was, to some degree, a bold move and one that was intended to make a difference in that discussion about energy in the future.
After Gordon repeated his net negative emissions goal at an appearance at Harvard in October, Wyoming's Republican Party passed a vote of no confidence in him. But he says heat from the right won't deter him from pursuing what he calls an all-of-the-above energy policy.
Whatever you're going to do in energy, probably you're going to have something to do in Wyoming. We have tremendous wind resources. We have the largest reserves of uranium, important for nuclear energy. The largest coal producer, we're number 8 in oil, number 9 in natural gas. 83% of our energy is exported.
That will soon include nuclear power from a next-generation reactor to be built in Wyoming with a $500 million investment from Bill Gates. Huge wind farms already dot Wyoming's landscape, with the biggest one yet on the way.
Because the wind blows basically 24/7, 365 days a year.
Bill Miller is president of the Power Company of Wyoming, which is beginning to build what will be the largest wind farm in the continental United States, in the middle of a geographic break in the Continental Divide.
All the winds which blow from west to east pretty much are funneled through this part of the country.
Miller drove to the top of a place called Chokecherry Knob to give us a taste of the wind.
So when this is up and running, how many turbines will be out here?
Current plan calls for 600 turbines.
And how much energy will that generate?
So they'll generate around 12 million megawatt hours of power a year.
And that's enough to power how many homes?
Million two.
Wyoming doesn't have anything close to that many homes. It has the smallest population of any of the 50 states. So the plan is to build a new 800-mile-long transmission line to send that power to California, which needs and wants it.
What's this going to cost?
The wind farm will be something north of $5 billion. The transmission line will be something north of $3 billion capital investment.
That's a big investment.
Yes.
The project is bankrolled by billionaire Philip Anschutz, who owns the company Bill Miller runs, and who first made his fortune in oil.
Society has spoken. That's what this country is going to go to, is renewable energy. More importantly, it's a project that contributes to the zero carbon initiatives that we strongly believe in. It's going to happen, and this is the best place for it to happen.
At this past summer's windy groundbreaking ceremony for the transmission line, Bill Miller was joined not just by Republican Governor Mark Gordon,
We have a great future ahead of us.
but also by 2 members of President Biden's cabinet.
The way we've tried to navigate this is to find something for everyone. And I think that's
Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it is. Honestly, I think if people are going to embrace how we get to a carbon neutral, carbon negative future, it has to be by saying we're all going to be a little bit better by embracing innovation.
If a single picture can capture Wyoming's energy past, present, and future, this may be it. A fully loaded coal train passing in front of a huge wind farm. Remember, this state still produces more coal than any other by far.
The likelihood that we will truly, as a world, move away from fossil fuels is very low.
Holly Krutka runs the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. Before shifting to academia, she worked for Peabody, the largest coal company in America.
82% of our global energy consumption is fossil fuels.
82%.
82%. It has not changed.
Because of that stark fact, Krutka and her colleagues are focused on taking the CO2 out of fossil fuels like coal before it reaches the atmosphere, with a technology called carbon capture and storage.
There are carbon capture and storage projects in America working right now. There's just not enough. The capture side, we're there today.
We can do it now.
Right now, yes.
The technology is there, but is it economically feasible?
It will always be cheaper to do nothing than to add carbon capture and storage. If you want to reduce emissions, this is part of the solution. We have to decide, is it worth the cost?
At the huge Dry Fork coal-fired power plant near Gillette, the University of Wyoming is operating what it calls the Integrated Test Center. Some of the flue gas that would otherwise go up the smokestack is siphoned off into labs like this one, where the Japanese company Kawasaki is testing methods for making carbon capture more economical. Wells 10,000 feet deep have also been drilled to show that captured CO2 can be stored underground forever. How big a deal would it be to find an affordable way to capture carbon at the point of emission, say in power plants around the world?
It would be a game changer for certain.
You know, there are a lot of naysayers who say that this is a pipe dream. It'll never happen. What do you say to them? How do you convince them?
Well, I say we're trying it. Then I know people will say, well, you're just trying to extend the life of the coal mines. I am. But I'm also trying to do that in a way that is going to do more for climate solutions than simply standing up a whole bunch of wind farms or sending up a whole bunch of solar is.
With his all-of-the-above approach, Mark Gordon is trying to put every kind of energy project on a fast track, including Bill Miller's huge wind farm. How long did you think it was going to take when you started?
When I originally started, I thought we could probably get this entitled and under construction within 5 years.
And it's been 17?
17.
Why so long?
Primarily the permitting process, the bureaucracy of the federal government.
You told me coming up here that the process was kind of like a nightmare.
It was difficult. Maybe nightmare is a little bit too strong, but it was a very difficult process.
So how important is it to reduce regulatory and permitting barriers?
I think it's massive. Permitting reform, I think, is one of our biggest challenges at a federal level. It is something that's being embraced by both sides.
Both the Biden administration and congressional Republicans have endorsed the idea of streamlining permitting for energy projects. Actually doing it is another story. In Wyoming, Governor Gordon has done what he can.
One thing I can share is that it's a state that's very welcoming to innovators in the energy space.
Cully Cavness is co-founder of a company called Crusoe Energy Systems. About 5 years ago, it decided to tackle the problem of flaring, when gas produced at oil wells is simply burned into the atmosphere.
If you could capture it all, it would power about 2/3 of Europe's electricity. It's a very large amount of waste.
And we're just burning it off.
We're burning it off because there's no pipeline there.
Cavness and his colleagues came up with the unconventional idea of putting a small electricity generating power plant right where that gas was being flared and wasted.
What we do is we tap into that gas line, we bring the gas over to a power generation system, and then that generates electricity, and we take that electricity directly into our on-site data center to power hundreds or thousands of computers, and then we network the computers to the outside world with fiber or satellite internet to get it off-site.
So you take a data center and just basically put it on top of the wellhead.
Exactly. It's a modern data center in every way when you're standing inside of it. And then you step out the door and you're in an oil field.
Crusoe Energy first used those electricity-gobbling data centers to mine Bitcoin. Now, most of that computer power is being used by artificial intelligence companies. The first place to let them try this in 2018 was Wyoming.
That's not necessarily an idea that everyone's going to embrace automatically right off the bat before it's been done before. Wyoming was. They invited us to come do it for the first time here. We did it at a small scale. We proved that it could work. And that helped us attract the funding and the other projects that have helped us scale to where we are today.
How many of these centers do you have up and running currently?
We're approaching 200 by the end of the year. We'll have about 200 of our modular data centers deployed throughout the United States and now internationally.
So how do you assess your environmental impact?
So today we're operating at a scale of more than 20 million cubic feet of gas per day that would have otherwise been flared and wasted. We're preventing that flaring. It's on the order of several 100,000 cars per year being taken off the road in terms of the avoided emissions impact.
Are you trying to send out a message to the rest of the country, even the rest of the world? If you have a renewable or a climate-friendly idea, bring it here. Bring it to Wyoming.
Love to. We want to be part of this solution. There are some really remarkable things that if we stop talking about what we shouldn't do and start talking about what we can do and how we can embrace that future, and that's what we're dedicated to here in Wyoming.
Temperatures in the Arctic continue to warm twice as fast as the rest of the world. That's according to the U.S. government's latest climate report. The past 5 years in the Arctic have been the warmest there since records began in 1900. Decades ago, an eccentric Russian geophysicist warned that frozen soil, called permafrost, contained enough greenhouse gas itself to pose a threat to the climate if it ever melted. Science scoffed at Sergei Zimov's warning, but now that the permafrost is collapsing, the world is listening. Recently, we traveled to the Siberian Arctic to meet Zimov, who has devised a scheme to save the world in a place that he named for the last ice age, Pleistocene Park.
Our trip took 3 days, and our final leg in an adventure of geoscience was on an aeronautical fossil, a Soviet-era Antonov. We approached a Siberia we had never seen in our imaginations, a forest touching the horizon in a land sequined with lakes. This was far north even by a Siberian compass, above the Arctic Circle where the Kolyma River fills the East Siberian Sea. 15 time zones from New York, we found the aspiring ghost town of Chersky. A trading port in Soviet times, Chersky was gutted by the fall of communism, losing 80% of its residents. There's not much reason to visit, unless, like many scientists today, you're beating a path to the Northeast Scientific Station to meet its founder, 63-year-old Sergei Zimov.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Scott.
I'm Sergei.
Nice to see you, Sergei.
He welcomed us in summer, when fireweed enjoys a few weeks of liberation. But 40 Siberian winters remained indelible on Zimov's face, the price of solitude for a geophysicist who longed to be remote from his communist bosses.
When people hear the word Siberia, they think about exile, but it sounds to me like exile's exactly what you had in mind.
Yes, only one problem, so long winter.
The winter's long.
Yes.
Winters are long as ever, but not as cold. This ground was once so icy, humankind named it permafrost. But in the 1990s, Zimov noticed it wasn't so permanent.
Frozen ground, do you hear?
Yep.
It's roof of permafrost.
He can remember when his shovel wouldn't bite the frozen surface. But now he's down more than 6 feet.
In the past, all our soil, which was melted in summer, freeze. everywhere totally, and it's happened usually in November, December. Now, in all winter, it did not freeze.
What does that tell you?
It means permafrost is melt.
This is a warning to the world because organic matter in the permafrost, plants and animals, has been frozen for hundreds of thousands of years. As it thaws, microbes consume that organic matter and release carbon dioxide and methane, greenhouse gases, which contribute to a warmer climate.
We just pulled this up out of the hole, and it's burning my fingers, it's so cold.
Yes, soil with water, and water is ice. In 5 minutes it will be melt.
Years ago, Zimov calculated there is enough carbon in permafrost to threaten the world. But big science gave that idea a cold shoulder, maybe in part because of Zimov himself. He endures Siberian winters when most Russians head south. He enjoys a refreshing vodka from time to time, smokes like a Soviet steel mill, and often just lies down to think.
I sometimes describe him as somewhere between a madman and a genius.
Max Holmes is a leading climate scientist and deputy director of the Woods Hole Research Center in Massachusetts. He told us Zimov's key discovery was that Siberian permafrost held far more carbon than anyone knew. When Zimov made this observation, he couldn't get his papers published in scientific journals.
It can take a while to get papers published that fly in the face of conventional wisdom.
But science warmed to Zimov's theory, and now he's published dozens of papers in science journals. Max Holmes has made several visits to Zimov's station.
The estimates of how much carbon is locked up in permafrost keep going up, and most of us were probably thinking about the upper meter.
The upper 3 feet or so of the soil.
The upper 3 feet, that's right. If you go down much deeper than that, the carbon content's very low. But what's special about this area where Zimov is, the carbon content of the permafrost extends to much greater depths. So consequently, there's an awful lot of carbon that's locked up there.
Scientists estimate there is more greenhouse gas in permafrost than in all of the world's remaining oil, natural gas, and coal. There's no consensus about how much of it could be released.
How far below the surface are we right now?
Right now we are about 10 meters.
So about 30 feet.
Yeah.
10 times deeper than originally thought, we found the remains of Ice Age plants and microbes.
Let's see if we can take some samples.
With Zimov's chief collaborator, his son, Nikita.
It's a ticking carbon bomb, as it's called.
A carbon bomb?
Yeah.
Nikita Zimov grew up here with his father and sensibly moved south for college, leaving behind the old man in the river. But Nikita's plan to be a mathematician melted away when Sergei asked his son to return to see what he had seen. A few hours from the research station, there's a vast subsidence of permafrost, sort of a rolling landslide called Duvany Yar. Geology is a slow science, but here it's almost a spectator sport. The bones of extinct woolly mammoths are thawing after more than 12,000 years. The collapse of frozen Earth is happening in much of the Arctic, including Alaska. 25% of the northern hemisphere is permafrost. The Zimovs have a theory, many would say a crazy idea, for diffusing the carbon bomb. They want to cool the permafrost by returning part of Siberia to the Ice Age, or at least what it looked like in those days, known as the Pleistocene era.
If we were standing on this hill in the Pleistocene era, what would we see?
No any trees. It looks like grasslands and savanna, and you will see around 1,000 of mammoths, around maybe 5,000 of bison, around maybe 10,000 of horses around this place, and also lions.
Lions?
Yes, main predator was lions here.
Sergei Zimov told us when man became the main predator, the woolly mammoth and other large grazers were hunted to extinction. Forest replaced grasslands, and that made Siberia vulnerable to a warming climate because trees trap more heat than grass, and winter temperatures of 40 below can't freeze the permafrost if there are no herds of animals to trample the insulating snow.
So this is what you use instead of a mammoth?
Yeah.
As a demonstration project they call Pleistocene Park, Nikita Zimov is knocking down trees over 54 square miles and restocking the big grazers. The Zimovs believe returning the land to its Ice Age appearance will cool the permafrost even in a warming world.
You're trying to bring the animals back now. How can you do that?
Physically, I mean, or morally, or financially?
All three, but let's start with physically. You need what? Hundreds of thousands, millions of these animals?
You need to start with something. Second, you need to prove people that the concept works. And to prove that concept works, for many things, you don't need millions of animals.
You brought up the moral issue of bringing the animals in here. What do you mean by that? I mean, some people say you're playing God.
I think it's not me playing God. It was our ancestors who was playing God 15,000 years ago. Humans came and they dropped the number of animals worldwide. And we are just trying to get this back.
This is where the Zimovs' experiment gets crazier. What they need is the greatest tree crusher of the last 20,000 years, and they are surrounded with evidence of the once abundant woolly mammoth.
That's amazing.
It's young female.
Young female mammoth. This weighs at least 20, 25 pounds. Do you need the woolly mammoth to bring all of this back in the park?
It's like, do you need your right arm to live and do your job? No, you don't need it, but with your arm, you will do it better. So same with mammoths.
Today, one place you might get a woolly mammoth is in Boston, Massachusetts, specifically in the lab of Harvard geneticist George Church.
Sergey is hoping that you're going to deliver a mammoth to him. Can you do that?
I think he's hoping that we will deliver an animal that is very similar to the ones that used to roam there. We need cold-resistant elephants. That's what he would like.
Church is another scientist who's made the trek to Zimov's world. He returned to his renowned genetics lab with DNA from mammoth bones.
If you look at the 23 genomes of the elephants, there's lots of evidence of lots of interbreeding all over the place among the different so-called species. So in a way, we're just recreating a hybrid that could easily have existed.
When do you imagine you might be able to pull up a truck and deliver this creature to Pleistocene Park?
I would say that probably in 5 years we'll know whether we can get this to work for mice and maybe pigs and elephants. And then if we can get embryos to grow in the laboratory all the way to term, then it's probably a decade.
The Zimovs have not convinced everyone in climate science. Critics say they lack long-term temperature records of the permafrost, and their work is restricted to a relatively small area.
You know, to the untrained eye, someone could come away from a meeting with Sergey thinking that he's a crackpot.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he kind of plays the part.
But as a climate scientist, how do you evaluate him?
And I think he's usually right. Certainly, he has controversial ideas, and a lot of them, I think, end up being supported over time.
What do you think of his concept of Pleistocene Park?
Fascinating theory. I'm fascinated by the science that can be done to figure out if it's correct. I'm glad he's pursuing this. We need to think about solutions.
The Zimovs have little funding for their big idea. The government donated the land, and their income flows from the rent that they charge visiting scientists for the research station. Theirs is science on a shoestring, with a very long timeline.
Sergey, you've devoted your life to this, but I wonder why you thought it was important that Nikita devote his life to this.
Why it's important? Our experiment, it's a long time experiment. Decades.
It'll take decades.
Yes. And it's also, you think about my grandchildren.
They have some intriguing results in the early days of Pleistocene Park. Data show the permafrost is becoming colder where heat-trapping trees have been cut down. It's a little more weight on the genius side of the madman scale, and perhaps early evidence that resurrecting the future of the world may depend on burying Siberia's past.
Last month, the world's top climate scientists delivered a sobering warning. Their mammoth report to the UN boiled down to one message: act now before the climate breakdown becomes unstoppable. The report says extreme weather has forced millions of people from their homes and devastated food supplies. Oil and gas emissions are at a record high. The UN report calls for drastic cuts in fossil fuels. But if our old technologies got us into this mess, can new ones get us out? Among politicians, corporations, and billionaires, one new technology is gaining traction. It's called direct air capture, that vacuums carbon dioxide out of thin air and locks it away underground. Sound like science fiction? We thought so too, until we went to Iceland to see the world's first commercial direct air capture plant in operation. Here, on a frigid plain near the Arctic Circle, worries about an overheating planet seemed far away. Yet tiny Iceland has put itself on the front line with a new kind of machine that will fight climate change by sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. This is Orca, the first commercial direct air capture plant on Earth.
What are these fans? How does this work?
Here you see the backside of these collectors where the air is being pulled through the system by aid of these fans.
Carlos Hertel is Chief Technology Officer for Climeworks, the Swiss company that built Orca. He told us as the fans draw air in, the carbon dioxide is trapped by a special filter inside these giant collectors, each the size of a shipping container. The captured CO2 is then siphoned off to storage tanks. We had to shout over the powerful fans as a bitter wind whipped around us.
So you didn't come for this wonderful weather?
No, we did not. We knew that the winters were harsh, but it's a good real-life test as well for the plant.
What you're describing almost sounds like science fiction. But what you're saying is that we can actually do this.
People never doubted the fundamental physics or chemistry of it, but realizing it under real-life conditions is a whole different matter. And that's what this system shows. It can be done.
Climeworks is now building a new plant in Iceland 10 times the size of Orca that will look like this, a modular design that Hertel told us can be easily assembled. But capturing the CO2 is only half of the story.
So this is where the magic happens.
The second half starts here in these metal igloos, where the CO2 is sent to be buried in the porous volcanic rock of Iceland.
So this pipe is actually filled with water.
Sandra Osk is a geologist with Carbfix, an Icelandic company that pioneered the groundbreaking injection method.
Here we have the CO2, and the CO2 is actually dissolved in water, so it's actually just fizzy water.
Just fizzy water?
Yeah. And this fizzy water is being injected here into the injection well.
How far down does it go?
It actually reaches over a mile down.
A mile down?
Yeah.
The fizzy water is shot like a soda stream into Iceland's basaltic rock, where it reacts with the minerals and hardens to stone in less than 2 years.
So the fizzy water turns into this
Yes. So
in just a matter of years.
So you take this gas that you can't see, you turn it into fizzy water, and then it turns to stone, and you don't have to worry about it.
Turned into stone. It's quite amazing.
Carbfix didn't invent the process, nature did. But nature takes millennia. After years of experimenting in Iceland's grueling outdoor laboratory, Carbfix figured out how to speed things up. Aerospace engineer Carlos Hertel told us Orca was a milestone. Now the hard part starts, scaling up fast enough to slow climate change.
Whether we are taking the right direction will depend as much on societal things than on technical matters. Am I optimistic as an engineer? I am, absolutely. Am I optimistic as a citizen? Maybe half-half. I haven't made up my mind yet.
This goal can be reached technically. It's just whether we have the political and social will to do it.
I think that's the exact right way of looking at it.
There's been a stampede of investment. Microsoft, Airbus, insurance giant Swiss Re have poured in millions of dollars, but it's a stupefying challenge. Orca is built to take out the emissions of about 800 cars, or 4,000 tons of CO2 a year, a tiny fraction of the annual 10 billion tons scientists say we need to remove from the atmosphere.
It's the problem of our generation. It's like a moonshot. It's going.
Kalluri Helgason is an astrophysicist with CarbFix. He told us studying space helped him to think big. We met him on a barren stretch of rock that could have been Mars, but Helgason told us he saw potential.
We need big solutions. We need to return the carbon back to where it came from, which is the Earth.
Tell me what you're doing here.
This will be a first-of-a-kind carbon mineral storage terminal, which means that we are going to bring in CO2, transport it from industrial point sources in Europe, and ship it here and inject it for full mineral storage.
It will be the world's first industrial-scale underground disposal site for CO2, capable of handling 3 million tons a year. Helgason sketched out a new world where tankers running on green methanol would transport carbon dioxide from European businesses to Iceland.
Is this going to happen fast enough to help us with climate change?
I don't know. To be perfectly honest, we are demonstrating the first mineral storage hub here at the megaton scale. Whether that will happen in time, that is not entirely up to us. That is up to politicians, governments, financiers, societies. And quite frankly, we are running out of time.
Direct air capture as it now exists is expensive and energy intensive. In Iceland, that energy is geothermal, renewable and green. That's not the case elsewhere. So governments in Europe and the US have dangled billions of dollars of tax breaks to encourage companies to take the plunge. But there's a bigger question than just who writes the check.
Do you fear that people will think, oh, well, we can now clean the air. We can just take the CO2 out of the air, so we can carry on with business as usual?
All the time. Yeah, but that's not how it works. We must stop the emissions and wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. That's what we need to do right now. On top of that, we also must take down the carbon that we've already put up in the atmosphere. Only then will we reach our climate goals. So carbon capture can never be an excuse for continuing business as usual.
But it's that business as usual that critics are warning against as direct air capture expands to the U.S. That's because here, oil companies are one of the technology's biggest boosters. They have been capturing CO2 to inject into oil wells for decades, not to bury it, but to flush out more oil. For Kalluri Helgason of CarbFix and many others, that's a non-starter.
We don't see the need to work with the oil and gas sector.
Well, if the oil and gas industry could help with the financing of the direct air capture, why not team up with them?
We don't need them for direct air capture. And quite frankly, we don't want there to be an oil and gas industry in 40, 50 years.
There will still be an oil industry in 50 years. I have no doubt about that. I think our company, though, will be a different company by 2050.
That company is Occidental Petroleum, and Vicki Holub is CEO. She wants to turn Oxy into what she calls a carbon management company. It has set aside more than $1 billion to build what will be the world's largest direct air capture plant in Texas.
So this would represent the CO2 that's equivalent to taking 200,000 cars off the road.
Holub showed us the Texas version of how CO2 would be sucked out of the air.
These are air contact towers.
Some of the captured CO2 will be locked away underground, just as we saw in Iceland. Some will still be used to extract more oil. But Holub told us using carbon sucked out of the air means the new oil produced is what she calls carbon neutral. That was hard to wrap our heads around.
But you'll be using carbon that you're capturing and taking out of the air to produce more oil that will then generate more carbon.
But the oil will emit less carbon than the CO2 we've injected to get it. So we've put more, at least the equivalent, and sometimes more CO2 in the ground to get that oil than the oil will emit when used.
Holub told us producing oil this way is essential in the transition to a green economy. Airlines and ships, for example, would need to run on fossil fuels until a sustainable alternative is found. That could take years. Until then, Holub argues, using CO2 to get that oil helps keep a lid on emissions.
Your critics will say you can't trust an oil company talking about reducing CO2, that your mission here is tantamount to greenwashing.
I would first say that we would never spend $1.2 billion for greenwashing. So we've got a monumental task ahead of us. The way that the CO2 enhanced oil recovery process works is that we can reduce more out of the atmosphere than what our products will emit when used. And so if that's not a concept that people can get, then we will not have a chance to achieve what we need to achieve.
Holub told us she knows critics of big oil are suspicious and that many feel industry isn't moving fast enough to avoid a climate catastrophe. On that point, Holub doesn't disagree. She told us with the help of tax incentives, Occidental plans to build 130 more direct air capture plants by 2035.
We know how to make it happen. We know how to drill the wells. We know how to safely sequester it.
We were in Iceland and we were talking to some of the direct air capture companies, and to be blunt, they don't quite believe you.
We're going to walk the talk. That's the only way that does it. Words will never convince anybody. We need to get the direct air capture up and working. We need to make it better, make it more economical, and start having it developed all around the world.
The next decade will be critical if the direct air capture industry is to grow big enough to make an impact. Both CarbFix and Climeworks told us they will be expanding to the U.S. Neither plans to work with the American oil industry.
The price of oil is up, gas-guzzling cars are out, and a race for a fuel-free, practical electric car is on. It includes the usual suspects, Detroit, Japan, Germany. But here's a surprise. A newcomer with no experience at building cars has entered the race, Silicon Valley. The jury is still out on whether electric cars can ever really be practical. But the computer geeks in California are betting that their inventiveness can beat out Detroit's cumbersome bureaucracy in producing a viable electric. One of the reasons electric cars have never taken off has been battery technology. A few years ago, someone wondered, why not use the batteries they put in laptop computers, called lithium-ion batteries? That's when the environmentally conscious high-tech industry in California jumped in. This is the first all-electric sports car, the Roadster, made by Tesla Motors, a small startup in Northern California.
Yeah, you can floor it. No problem. It'll be fine.
All right, here I go. Ready? The chairman of Tesla, Elon Musk, says the Roadster can accelerate from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. It's propelled by more than 6,000 finger-sized laptop batteries and not a single drop of oil. Silicon Valley's Elon Musk made his fortune by inventing PayPal, the online banking service. He launched Tesla 5 years ago with no experience at all in the car business. Now he has over 1,000 orders for the Roadster from people like George Clooney and Governor Schwarzenegger. They can afford it. This beautiful Roadster costs a fortune.
$109,000.
$109,000.
It's a deal.
It's a deal.
And our car is twice the efficiency of a Prius. So a Prius is a gas-guzzling hog by comparison with our cars.
He says the Roadster can go over 200 miles before you have to plug it in to any ordinary wall outlet. It can take anywhere from 4 to 30 hours for a full charge.
It's very easy. It's just like plugging in a hairdryer. It's super simple. Yeah?
Even a girl could do it, is that what you're trying to say?
Even a girl.
From the beginning, Musk wanted to prove that innovative and nimble Silicon Valley could build a better green car than lumbering, bureaucratic Detroit.
Outside of Detroit, everybody thinks Detroit is dumb.
Well, they think you're hidebound.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing.
Bob Lutz, vice chairman of General Motors, is the man in charge of developing their new products. And he says he owes Tesla and its Roadster a debt of gratitude.
If a small Silicon Valley startup believes that they can do a commercially viable electric car, are we going to sit here as General Motors and say, well, a guy in California can do it, but we can't? Now, that didn't sound very good.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah.
And so the race was on, with Lutz overseeing the research and development of the Chevy Volt, which is a 4-door family electric.
So you see that it's got twin screens.
The Volt is not purely electric. It's called a plug-in hybrid. It'll drive on battery power alone for 40 miles. Go beyond that, and a small gasoline engine kicks in to recharge the battery while you keep driving.
78% of trips in the United States are under 40 miles a day. If all those people had Volts, you would have 78% of Americans basically never using another drop of gasoline.
Everything about the Volt, he says, works like a conventional car, except there's no noise.
There's one thing we can do. For people who miss the sound of the engines, we sell them a CD with various engine sounds. So you'd be able to pick Ferrari V12 or, Le Mans Corvette.
A car that can go up to 40 miles before it uses any gas at all.
GM is already touting the car in TV ads, even though they don't yet have a working prototype.
The real trick on the car is software. The car needs to know where home plate is. So if you, for some reason, have gone from work instead of directly home, you've gone shopping, and you're starting to run out of battery on the way home, the computer will tell the gas engine, look, he's 5 miles from home, only run for 3 minutes because he only needs enough to get home.
What about safety? In 2006, Dell was forced to issue the biggest recall in electronics history when its lithium-ion batteries burst into flames. Lutz says GM has solved that problem with its batteries, but they need a lot more testing to check how durable and reliable they are in extreme weather and real road conditions. Still, Lutz insists the Volts will be in dealerships in 2010. We've spoken to people who say, Lutz is crazy. They cannot do this by then. It's just not going to happen.
Right. We'll see. Somebody's going to have egg on their face.
It was GM with egg on its face in the late 90s for killing off its first electric cars, the EV1s, and then crushing them into scrap metal, which fueled theories that GM had conspired with the oil industry to get rid of the electric car.
I think even our lawyers now would admit that perhaps crushing them was not the smartest thing in the world to do. I get emails that say, I hope you enjoy the billions that you got from the oil companies, you swine.
It's that history and his record of promoting SUVs and the Hummer that make people wonder about Lutz's new role in developing GM's new green cars. So let's talk about your own personal carbon footprint.
Yes.
How many helicopters do you own?
I have one and my wife has one. She's a
His and her
commercial
helicopters.
pilot. Yeah.
How many jets do you have?
I have 2.
Now, you have a terrible reputation with environmentalists, as you well know.
No, actually, some of them kind of like me, but go ahead anyway.
Well, they don't like what you said about global warming.
Right.
Do you want to repeat what you said about global warming?
Of course not, because this is a family network.
You don't think there's global warming? Is that really true?
You know, I'm not going to get into this because...
Because you got into so much trouble when you said it the first time.
That could be right, yeah.
What Lutz said in January is man-made global warming is a crock of shit. So he's no environmentalist. But he is a realist. Gone are the gas guzzlers. To save GM, he knows he has to come up with gas-efficient cars. But Detroit is broke, while in California, things are buzzing. The venture capitalists who funded the information superhighway are now pouring money into the actual highway, backing at least 30 small startup companies. Ray Lane is a senior partner at Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm that helped start Google and Amazon. Now he's investing in 3 electric car startups.
When I first started talking about the possibility of investing in automobiles, my partners thought I was crazy. We're not out of the woods yet. I haven't proven I'm not crazy yet.
One of his startups is Fisker Motors that's making the Karma, a 4-door plug-in hybrid like the Volt, with some added gee-whiz features.
This is a solar roof.
It's a solar roof. So this will generate electricity. It will not generate enough to drive the battery, though, like the engine does. Yeah. It will drive enough electricity to maybe cool the car while it's in the parking lot.
Some of the other startups in California are less conventional, like this all-electric. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's an Aptera due out this Christmas. But one issue with all these cars is that much of the electricity to power them would come from burning coal, which produces greenhouse gases. So they're not necessarily the perfect green solution. 4 years ago, we had the hydrogen car. 3 years ago, there was ethanol. Mm-hmm. And now it's the electric car.
Right.
In each case, there were such problems with them that everybody's focus moved on to the next thing. Isn't that going to happen again with these electric cars?
It could. I mean, that is what Silicon Valley is all about. A good entrepreneur that fails, we will pick that person up, fund them again to do something new if it's a good idea.
Is there any thinking with these 30 little Henry Fords that we've got to crush Detroit?
Some. I mean, there was a company pretty well known, Tesla,
Yeah.
For a long time believed that what would be their advantage is they had no car people, no Detroit people. We're going to build a vehicle company exactly like we build a computer company. So it's when you have your car repaired, it's going to be going into your Apple store. We'll give you a latte, you watch your car being repaired. These are real statements. So they've certainly found out you cannot build a car company without car people.
There's sort of this feeling of, especially in Silicon Valley, that people in the automobile business aren't very smart. And then they get into it and they find out, holy mackerel, look at all this government regulation, look at what everything costs. And then once they're into it, they figure out, hey, this isn't an easy business after all. And I think that's about the point where Tesla is right now.
But these startups out in California don't have the union problems, the healthcare costs, the labor issues. These startups don't have boardrooms, they don't have nervous shareholders.
Yeah, but they have no experience in the car business.
And you think that outweighs all of this?
Absolutely, sure.
It is true that Tesla is now hiring lots of people with Detroit on their resumes. Their next project is development of a 4-door family sedan that'll compete with the Chevy Volt. Did you used to think this was going to be easier than it was?
Yes, I probably thought it would be a little easier.
How much more has the project cost than you thought it was going to cost so far? Twice as much?
Probably,
3 times as much?
No, probably twice as much, I think, ish, thereabouts.
How much did you put into this company?
Oh man, about $55 million.
$55 million of your own money.
Yeah, it's a little more than I expected.
No one's figured out how to make an electric car cheap. Tesla plans to sell its 4-door sedan for $60,000. Lutz at GM wants the Volt to be more of an everyman car. How much is it going to cost me, the consumer?
I started out very optimistically and said, okay, well, I think we can sell this thing for $20,000. And that turned out to have been like one of those, I wish I hadn't said that. And then we started hoping for well below 30. And now we're trying to keep it south of 40.
$40,000 is not an everyman car by any stretch.
That's true.
To get buyers, GM will have to sell the car at a loss. Bad news for a company already burning $1 billion in cash every month.
I'll tell you what, we can afford a tiny little loss on a car, but we can't afford a $20,000 loss per car. That's just not on.
That's because GM is in financial straits. Bob Lutz is trying not only to produce a moneymaker, but also prove with the Chevy Volt that his company and his town are still the address for innovative cars. So a lot about General Motors' reputation and image is riding on this.
That is probably an understatement.
And so basically, in your mind, it has to succeed.
Of course it does. For what it's worth, I stake my reputation on it.
The transition from fossil fuels to sustainable electric power has gone mainstream, most visibly in the auto industry. The major car companies are chasing Tesla with ambitious plans for fleets of electric vehicles. Those cars and trucks run on lithium batteries. The U.S. has massive quantities of lithium, but has been slow to invest in the mining and extraction of the metal. That's about to change. Lithium operations powered by clean energy are being developed in a long-neglected, impoverished part of California by the Salton Sea, not far from the Mexican border. The region is being called Lithium Valley, and just like the 1849 gold rush, companies are racing to strike it rich. East of San Diego and south of Palm Springs lies the Salton Sea, California's largest inland body of water. Spreading east from the sea is a giant, underground, mineral-rich geothermal field boiling with potassium, sodium, and lithium.
It is a world-class lithium resource.
This is.
When you hear estimates of how big this resource could be, it's usually measured on annual tons produced. And we're confident that this is in excess of 300,000 tons a year. Right now, that's way more than half of the world supply of lithium.
Eric Spomer is CEO of Energy Source Minerals, a company based by the Salton Sea in California's Imperial Valley. It's steaming ahead with plans to recover lithium using an existing electric plant powered by the vast underground geothermal field. We're moving into an era of green technology, especially with our cars. Where does this fit in?
Our more conservative projection would support 7.5 million electric vehicles a year, which is half of the total U.S. car sales, cars and trucks.
Coming from the Salton Sea area?
Correct.
What about this plant?
This plant will be 20,000 tons per year, which is equivalent to about 500,000 vehicles per year.
Once up and running, the tons of lithium generated here will be shipped, refined, and processed into millions of rechargeable electric car batteries.
Over 50% of our lineup and our retail sales will be from battery electric vehicles by the end of the decade.
Mark Stewart is head of Stellantis North America, a global car maker that owns some of America's best-known brands, including Chrysler, Jeep, and Ram trucks.
It really is, quote unquote, the industrial revolution, the next phase, right? This is the most interesting and exciting time to be a part of our industry.
Stellantis is investing $35 billion in an ambitious, historic transformation.
We're reimagining our factories, our assembly plants. They're already rolling our plug-in hybrids, as well as looking to 2 new battery joint ventures that are in full construction right now.
The new industrial revolution?
It absolutely is. It's really the biggest technological changes in our industry in nearly 100 years.
We were down in the Salton Sea region. They believe they can supply the lithium needs for all American car manufacturers.
Absolutely. That is the case.
Whatever they can produce, you guys will be buying it.
We for sure will take as much as we can get and as much as we have already secured early.
Lithium is key to powering electric cars. The dense metal helps make batteries rechargeable. There's a lot of it around, but extracting lithium is dirty business. Most comes from rock mines in Australia, or as powder evaporated from mineral ponds in South America. The U.S. has one lithium evaporation plant in Nevada. Energy Source plans to break ground on a clean billion-dollar facility here by the Salton Sea in the next few months. So the plant will fit in this spot right here.
Correct. That's spot right there.
That's not a big footprint.
No.
What are these?
We call them the mud pots. And they are CO2 vents, hot CO2 with fluid that's bubbling to the surface.
So this is evidence of the heat and activity going on underground.
Correct.
The 600-degree geothermal brine that powers the region's electric plants comes from more than a mile beneath the earth. The boiling brine produces clean steam, which drives turbines to generate enough electricity to power 400,000 homes. In the past, the mineral-rich brine was simply returned to the earth. Now, Energy Source plans to extend the process and extract lithium from the brine before re-injecting it underground.
Our process in combination with this resource will be the cleanest, most efficient lithium process in the world.
And how long before the lithium processed here will be in commercial use in the U.S.?
In 2025.
A lot of the components that go into the batteries have been coming from, anywhere around the world, but America.
Why was that?
We have a lot of decent resources in North America. They've just been undeveloped.
David Deek worked for Tesla, traveling the world to find the best sources of lithium as it was building up production of its electric vehicles, or EVs. Tesla turned to the lithium-ion battery to power its cars, the same kind of rechargeable battery Sony first mass-produced for its camcorders.
There was a new market for consumer electronics, but the vast majority is for electric vehicles.
And that was pretty much triggered by Tesla?
Triggered by Tesla. Also, there's a lot of EV growth and EV demand and production in China. That's been a big part of the global lithium demand story. Come on in.
Deek is now Energy Source's Chief Development Officer and says he had a eureka moment when he saw its unique technology. At the company's lab, Deek showed us the mechanics in miniature. The full-size plant will be 100 times larger. So what goes on inside this cylinder? Is it pellets, or what is the matrix?
Yeah, think of it as beads in a column, much like the activated carbon that you would find in a Brita filter. It works in a similar concept. A Brita filter will filter all impurities out of water.
Mm-hmm.
This sorbent is something that would only take in lithium and not absorb everything else.
The system takes just a few hours to turn this orange brine into this clear lithium solution, which will be dried into powder. And this is what everybody's looking for.
That's what everyone wants.
Here by the Salton Sea, Energy Source is leading the race for lithium. Warren Buffett's BHE Renewables runs 10 geothermal power plants in the region. And there's another on the drawing board by an Australian company, Controlled Thermal Resources. Both ventures are moving to tap the promise bubbling under the earth. CEO Rod Caldwell told us Controlled Thermal Resources had been fine-tuning the process at this test facility for 90 days.
We're producing lithium from live brine here behind us. This is our optimization plant.
Based on what it learns here, Controlled Thermal Resources plans to build a new plant for recovering lithium, which costs about $4,000 a ton to extract and currently is selling for 6 times more. The noise is from the machines cooling 600-degree brine, rising from the well, releasing steam.
And this is a battery-grade product from Salton Sea brine.
This for you is Eureka.
This is absolutely Eureka, yes.
Rod Colwell told us this bottle of clear lithium chloride is the purest product from this test facility so far.
This is the first time this has been in my hands. This happened last night, Bill, so I might take that home with me. That's about $10 worth of lithium right there, so...
You know it works.
We know it works.
The question here in the Salton Sea Basin is, will it work for everyone? This rich lithium resource lies beneath one of the poorest sections of California.
The Salton Sea was created when the Colorado River flooded the basin in 1905. But for the past 50 years, the main source of water has been chemical-laden agricultural runoff. And for decades now, the sea has been evaporating and shrinking. A once thriving tourist industry has been replaced by environmental decay, toxic dust, and economic hardship. And with unemployment in the region hovering around 16%, there's a lot riding on turning the Imperial Valley into Lithium Valley.
Governor Newsom called it, the Saudi Arabia of lithium. I think, it can change the landscape of the region.
Frank Ruiz, the Audubon Society's local program director, is fighting to include the community in that change. He was a commissioner on the state panel studying how the entire region can benefit from the potential underground.
You're an environmentalist. How do you reconcile the industrialization of this area with saving the wildlife and the communities?
We need to learn how to balance the tables. The lithium industry can be really good, for these communities. It can provide better paid jobs. It can provide more job opportunities, especially for the younger folks. It can provide the revenues, to offset the challenges that we have here at the Salton Sea.
Geologists predict once the industry is fully operational, the lithium underground should last for generations before running out. Good news for Stellantis, which ran out of batteries for its plug-in hybrid Jeep Wrangler last year.
We sold out.
What happened?
If I could turn back my crystal ball, Bill, I would have secured a little more capacity for last year.
To prevent that from happening in the future, Mark Stewart and Stellantis have committed to buying lithium from controlled thermal resources at the Salton Sea, knowing it will be years before its product is commercially viable.
We secured a large supply from them over a 10-year period because we are very positive on their technology.
So is car maker General Motors, which has invested in controlled thermal resources. The Department of Energy and U.S. automakers are eager for domestic lithium. The companies were stung when the pandemic disrupted the worldwide supply chain, stalling shipments of microchips, parts, and batteries. Still today, 3/4 of all lithium batteries are processed in Asia.
Current lithium, what typically happens, right, it's mined in one spot, it's moved across the world for processing and comes back. Think of all that additional cost, think of all that additional carbon that's being used to do that, and at the end, someone pays for it, and that's a consumer.
So will having this domestic supply of lithium help keep the cost of electric vehicles down?
It will certainly help.
Prices for electric cars are coming down and are projected to be on par with gas vehicles within a few years, driven in part by the tax incentives in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. Eric Spomer of Energy Source told us the tax benefits have also been a catalyst for developing domestic lithium.
We're starting to see big announcements of investments to create that domestic demand so it doesn't ever have to go across an ocean.
This seems like this is a game changer for American industry.
It's a competitive advantage. It's an opportunity that we can be a leader globally, and why not lead?
Exactly 6 months ago this evening, Hurricane Dorian slammed into the northern Bahamas. It was the 5th Category 5 Atlantic hurricane in just the last 3 years. Before that, there hadn't been a single Cat 5 storm in nearly a decade. There's a growing consensus among scientists that climate change is what's making hurricanes stronger and more destructive. That's very bad news for the Bahamas, a string of more than 700 low-lying islands stretching from Florida nearly down to Cuba, in the heart of what's come to be known as Hurricane Alley. But the Bahamas has found a ray of hope, specifically a solar array that can help its islands survive future hurricanes. And in the process, it may have important lessons the rest of the world should learn as Mother Nature continues to brew devastating storms like Dorian. With sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, gusts above 200, and a storm surge well over 20 feet in some spots,
Please pray for us.
Hurricane Dorian wreaked unimaginable havoc on the Bahamian islands known as the Abacos.
There's not enough words in the dictionary to describe what Hopetown looked like after that storm.
Hopetown has been Vernon Malone's home for all of his 82 years. His family has lived here since 1785. He's the town baker and grocer, and he and his wife rode out the storm in his store. It survived, but their home just up the street did not.
The entrance went right in there.
Vernon's son, Brian, had a home just around the corner. Had a home.
That pile of rubble we see there.
That's actually 2.5 houses. Mine's on the bottom.
Hopetown is a Bahamian landmark. Its candy-striped lighthouse dates to 1863 and is pictured on the country's $10 bill. The lighthouse stood up to Dorian, but as we saw coming into the harbor, not much else did.
I hear generators everywhere. Is this how you guys are getting through?
Yep.
Yep.
Brian Malone and Matt Winslow, an American who owns a vacation home on the island, told us why all those generators are still running.
The substation in Marsh Harbor, which feeds us the power, is destroyed. And then, of course, you can see all the utility poles are pretty much destroyed. So this isn't a case where you come in and replace some poles and you flick a switch. This is months and months and months of work.
Hopetown is on one of several small islands ravaged by Dorian, which then moved across 7 miles of open water to Marsh Harbor, the largest town in the Abacos. At least 60 people died in Marsh Harbor, and destruction is still everywhere. Total damage and loss from Dorian is estimated at $3.4 billion.
When you see the extent of the destruction, where do you even begin? How do you even begin?
That's always the question. Where do we begin?
Bahamian Prime Minister Hubert Minnis and Vianna Gardner, a top aide, visited Marsh Harbor with us and pointed to one huge priority: restoring electric power.
How do you bring this back?
The power, we had to make determination to set up microgrids.
The microgrids Prime Minister Minnis is talking about are small-scale systems. More and more, they're solar arrays with battery storage for when the sun's not shining. They can either feed electricity into the larger grid or operate independently to power a single facility or a neighborhood. The way electricity has been produced in the Bahamas is with diesel-fueled generating stations on each inhabited island, about 30 in all, feeding power to everyone through overhead lines.
The main power plant for this island is literally 25 miles south of here. That's 25 miles of line that has to be rebuilt.
Chris Burgess and Justin Locke run the Islands Energy Program for an American nonprofit called the Rocky Mountain Institute. They have solar projects throughout Hurricane Alley. After Category 5 Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, they put microgrids on the roofs of 10 schools. Maria also brushed St. Vincent. This is its first microgrid. Now the island's energy program has come to Marsh Harbor.
So how big will this solar array be?
15 acres, right through here.
That microgrid will satisfy 10% of Marsh Harbor's total power needs and will be built right between its government center and hospital. Both were without power for weeks after Dorian.
This is high ground, which makes it less vulnerable to storm surge or other types of disaster events.
So if a storm like Dorian hits again, the power to these two critical facilities stays on.
Correct.
The push to build storm-proof solar microgrids in the Bahamas began in 2017 after Hurricane Irma, another Category 5 storm, tore through tiny Ragged Island at the southern tip of the island chain.
After Ragged Island was devastated, I made a statement. Let us show the world what can be done. We may be small, but we can set an example to the world.
So it's your goal to make Ragged Island a green island?
Absolutely. Absolutely. After which we can expand it. We can expand it.
To see the Prime Minister's green experiment, we flew to Ragged Island with Whitney Hasty, CEO of government-owned utility Bahamas Power and Light. Engineer Burlington Strawn met us there and took us to what he calls the very first hurricane-proof solar microgrid being installed in the Bahamas.
Unlike other solar designs, it's very low to the ground. So this installation is rated to withstand 180-mile-an-hour winds.
Which is an even harder punch than Irma landed back in 2017.
There was significant devastation on this island. As you can see, some of the poles snapped right at the very base of the pole.
Snapped right at the base. Is that what happened all over the island?
That happened throughout the island.
This microgrid will produce enough electricity for Ragged Island's roughly 100 residents. The Prime Minister calls it a laboratory for the solar future. The past is a diesel generator needing boats to deliver fuel from hundreds of miles away. A system Whitney Hasty says is a nightmare.
In summer, we're almost on the verge of running out of fuel in some of these islands because bad weather sometimes prohibits the ships from actually getting to some of these locations.
The Bahamian government spends nearly $400 million a year on imported fuel to keep its power plants running and passes that cost along to its citizens.
They pay 3 to 4 times what we pay on the mainland U.S.
Right. That's
for
correct.
electricity here?
Right, and that isn't price gouging. I mean, that's just inherent cost.
Everything costs more in the islands. The bill to install this new solar microgrid is $3 million. Hasty insists it's money well spent.
So you have this initial big outlay to build these panels, but over time, the cost of generating power actually goes down.
Absolutely, absolutely. By using what God has blessed us with, which is the natural sun.
It's not a perfect solution on Ragged Island. Notably, the power from these panels will still feed into the vulnerable overhead power lines. The money's not there yet to bury them.
One of the first things that I think everyone can agree on is everything has to go underground.
Back in Hopetown, Matt Winslow says they have the funds to bury their lines. Americans with second homes here add a lot to the economy. Winslow's Family Foundation has donated nearly $1 million to rebuilding efforts. They already have a makeshift microgrid powering the fire station and health clinic, and Winslow has hired engineers to help plan a much bigger one on a nearby island.
It's possible that over in Great Abaco we could put, a solar array, 18 acres, and that power is piped through, preferably a new undersea cable to the island, and that could be a main source of our power.
That would be enough to power this island?
Absolutely.
The Bahamas' goal is to produce 30% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030. Justin Locke and Chris Burgess of the Islands Energy Program believe the country can do even better.
The price of renewables have come down to the point where they're now very, very competitive with diesel, and in most cases, way cheaper than diesel.
The key game changer has been battery storage. Battery storage has decreased in cost over 60% over the last 5 years. And what battery storage does is it enables the sun to shine when the sun is not shining. Renewables make more sense here than anywhere else in the world.
And microgrids in the Caribbean are starting to show their value. When earthquakes struck Puerto Rico in January, the entire island's big electrical grid was shut down for days. But remember those solar microgrids installed at schools? They kept providing power. The lessons can really apply anywhere.
California has the same system architecture as here in the Caribbean, right? Fossil fuel, long transmission distribution lines, right? And you see that PG&E had to proactively shut off power to millions of people in order to prevent fire.
If there had been these microgrids, might it have been that PG&E would not have had to cut off power to
Correct.
Millions of consumers?
Correct.
Here in the Bahamas, there are still huge economic obstacles. Losses from Dorian equal nearly 30% of the country's entire annual GDP.
You've got this incredible outlay to rebuild these islands that were devastated by Dorian. Can you afford to bring on a new form of electrical generation?
We cannot afford it. We recognize from day one that we cannot do it alone.
Just weeks after Dorian hit, Prime Minister Minnis spoke at the United Nations. He emphasized that most of the Bahamas was not damaged and eager for tourists, the lifeblood of the economy. Then he said that first world countries and their pollution are at least partly to blame for the threat of ever stronger hurricanes.
It is a threat which we cannot survive on our own. First world nations, and this is what I said at the UN, I said first world nations make the greatest contribution to climate change. They are the ones responsible for the changes that we see, the increase in velocity and ferocity of the hurricanes and the changes, typhoons that we see today. But we're the innocent victim. We're the ones that are being impacted by what you've created.
Minnis and leaders of other island nations have proposed that the U.S. and European countries contribute to an insurance fund. Think of it as a really rainy day fund to help rebuild from future storms.
That's what you say and what you said at the UN the first world nations should do.
Absolutely.
Are they doing it?
It's an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing discussion.
Does this make the change to renewable energy that much more important, imperative, urgent for you here in the Bahamas?
It is. Because even though our contribution to climate change is minimal, it's minuscule to compare with first world nation, but we still have a responsibility.
This past August, President Biden signed a sweeping climate bill into law, making wind power a priority, specifically offshore wind power. The goal is to capture the force of the wind in the open seas and convert it to power 10 million American homes by 2030. We have a long way to go. There are only 7 offshore wind turbines off the coast of the United States, compared to nearly 6,000 in Europe. Critics say they're expensive to build and maintain, unpredictable, and ugly. We wanted to see for ourselves, so we went to the largest offshore wind farm in the world along the northeast coast of England to discover the power of Grimsby. As you fly 200 miles north of London, along the coast, you can see the town of Grimsby below. 55 miles east of her port,
Morning, we are on our way to the Hornsey Wind Park, film crew on board.
You can't miss them. Elegant and a little eerie, white giants poking out of the North Sea like something out of a science fiction novel.
Inbound to the Hornsey Wind Park with 6 PLB.
This is the largest crop of offshore wind turbines in the world, known as the Hornsey Wind Farm. It is hypnotizing. More than 300 turbines spread across 335 square miles generate enough electricity to help power more than 2 million homes a day.
Beautiful day. Yeah, beautiful day.
To understand the power, size, and upkeep of this evolving technology, we geared up on land and traveled 90 minutes on the heaving North Sea with 24-year-old Bridie Salmon. Her job is to scale and service the turbines. My job, with the help of a little anti-nausea gum, was to simply hold down my lunch.
This is choppy out here.
Yeah, it is. How are you feeling?
I feel okay. It's more important, how do you feel?
Yeah, I'm feeling good. Like I say, I'd like to think I've got my sea legs on.
Yeah.
So,
When your last name is Salmon, negotiating rough waters is sort of in your DNA. Bridie's great-grandfather worked on the Grimsby docks. Her dad owns this 100-year-old smoked fish shop in town. Bridie was bartending when she decided to apply to an apprentice program to be a turbine technician. She was one of 7 people selected from a pool of 500.
Shall we have a look around here then, guys?
The apprentice program combines classroom instruction,
got a big drill bit on the bottom and it's spinning,
with hands-on work at sea. But we soon learned that Mother Nature is a temperamental teacher.
The weather here is ever-changing.
Yeah, we're holding on for our dear lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the North Sea. It's not something we can control, so every day is different, and it can change like that. So it's just part and parcel of the job. Anything to get these things turning. This is the environment for wind turbines. It's got to be windy.
As we approached the turbines, we suddenly felt small.
You don't get a sense of how large things are until you're right up under this.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, so at the very top, the nacelle, all the way to the top of the blades is half the size of the Eiffel Tower, which is pretty massive. And because you've got nothing normal to compare it to, like a building, you just see these in the distance, and then you're here, and they're pretty bloody huge.
Translation, they're nearly 600 feet high with spinning fiberglass blades, roughly the length of the world's largest passenger jet. Each blade weighs almost 30 tons. The turbines are partially assembled on shore, then shipped out to sea, where each blade is attached with surgical precision to the top of the turbine. Every angle has to be perfect to generate maximum power. Once installed, keeping them spinning is critical. Offshore wind engineers say one revolution can power one home in the UK for 24 hours. And that's where Bridie comes in.
It's raining.
Yeah.
It's windy.
Yeah. Can't wait. Just another day in the office. All right.
In choppy waters, Captain Peter Broughton has to find the sweet spot, maintaining constant contact between the bow and base.
Traffic seemed alliance.
Some days the winds are so high and seas so rough, the job can't be done. On this day, success.
Right, I'll see you later.
Okay,
Bye.
be careful.
Bridie harnesses herself to a cable,
Happy?
Yeah, you.
Yeah.
leaps to a ladder, and begins the climb rung by rung, 8 stories to the top.
Seawind Alliance V1 radio check.
On a narrow platform hanging over the North Sea, she makes her rounds,
The lights are working.
carefully inspecting and servicing the turbine. A job not for the faint of heart.
I'm gonna pop this in here.
What was that like the first time you made that climb?
Oh, exhausting. Exhausting. Yeah, it was because you've got all your safety kit on as well, so you've probably got about 10 kilograms of harnesses and claws, and you've got to be clipped in, so you've got that friction of climbing.
I would imagine it would be kind of scary.
Yeah, really scary. I remember there was one day, it was super windy, so we were up there and the top of the tower is moving. So you've got the seasickness, the motion sickness from the sea, and then the top of the tower is moving. So all day you're rocking, and it was cold and windy, and I remember coming back on shore, I was just rocking. I was like, I'm on land now, I don't need to rock, but it's pretty scary.
Benj Sykes says those kinds of extraordinary efforts are needed in extraordinary times. Sykes is the vice president of offshore wind at Ørsted, a Danish-based global energy supplier that runs the Hornsea wind farm.
You know, we have a cost of energy crisis in Europe and in Britain at the moment. That's driven by the pandemic, but also, of course, by the terrible situation in Ukraine. And all of that adds up to a real drive to find clean, cheap energy solutions.
About 5 years ago, Ørsted decided to sell off its oil and gas business and focus on renewable energies. Grimsby, a depressed fishing town, became the unlikely backdrop to Europe's clean energy movement.
Why here? Why Grimsby?
It's got a good port, and it's geographically really well located, physically, in terms of the water depth, in terms of the wind resource, and of course, places to connect to the national grid so that we can get that power to homes and businesses.
Long before Russia's invasion of Ukraine set off the energy crisis, the UK had a strategy to use 100% clean or renewable electricity by 2035.
When you talk about clean energy, you talk about solar, hydropower, biofuels. What makes offshore wind unique?
Offshore wind is really the only project in most countries where you can build it at the kind of power station scale that we need. If I think about the projects we're building here in the UK, that's almost 3 gigawatts, and that's broadly speaking the output of a nuclear power station. So we're talking large-scale infrastructure projects. Most of Europe is too populated to fit very, very large wind farms or solar farms, so that's why we've gone offshore.
One big criticism is costs. They're expensive to construct, to transmit, and to decommission. Is that cost passed on to consumers?
So that's simply wrong. Offshore wind power is one of the cheapest forms of electricity generation in the UK. We privately fund it together with investment partners that we bring in.
Privately you fund that?
Yeah, there's no public exposure to the costs of building offshore wind. And I think the thing that's made the most difference is the fact that we've had political consensus now for more than a decade, and that's given investors confidence to step in and put the big money on the table to get these projects away.
Gas and nuclear still make up a majority of the power supply flowing into UK homes and businesses, but this year 13% of Britain's energy has come from offshore wind. Only China produces more offshore wind power than the UK. Here's how it works. Wind turns the blades around a shaft inside the turbine, which spins a generator. Energy then travels down, going 300 feet beneath the water surface to cables buried under the seabed, connecting to an offshore substation, then to a power station on land, where that electricity created out at sea is transferred into homes and businesses, inviting the question, what happens if the wind stops blowing?
Using satellites and other technology, we can predict extremely accurately how much we're going to generate over the next days, which enables those who operate the grid to make very clear plans about where's demand going, where's supply going. I mean, if I look at the turbines that we've got out in Hornsea, they're operating 98, 99% of the time.
This is Grimsby's second act. Through the 1950s to 1970, the town hosted the largest fishing fleet in the world, with 700 trawlers, awash in cash, and a port fit for a visit from the Queen.
Oh, it was absolutely brilliant. The camaraderie, because you can say nearly 100% of the population would be associated with the fishing industry in some way.
Dennis Avery and Bob Formby were part of the town's fishing tradition.
What was it like?
No, it's a tough job. It's work from sailing till you get back in the port again. Working in the winter around Iceland and them places was pretty severe. But it's the kind of job that I would do again tomorrow.
In those days, you had two choices. You worked on the docks or you went to sea. Decker navigator.
Avery captained this hulking steel fishing trawler, the Ross Tiger, for 8 years.
If you caught a good trip and you're steaming home back to Grimsby with a fish room full of fish, you know, it's a marvellous feeling.
That marvelous feeling ended when Iceland, Britain's neighbor to the north, began enforcing fishing restrictions in their cod-rich waters.
Fish to Grimsby may shrink to a trickle.
What did you see happen in town when that happened?
Gosh, it was a disaster, to be quite honest, because everybody was involved some way in fishing. Like taxi drivers, the pubs, the dress shops and places like that. They all suffered.
You know, once the fishing sort of went, it all sort of died a death.
Wind power has breathed new life into Grimsby. Offshore energy company Ørsted says it's created over 500 jobs here and invested $11 billion in local wind farms. But there are plenty of people who worry the environmental impact of the wind turbines hasn't been sufficiently studied. And others say the industry has not created the number of jobs they've promised. But the concern of these retired fishermen is more practical.
We're not seeing benefit.
Your electricity bill hasn't gone down?
No, it's gone up, if anything. When they said about them, how we're going to get cheap electricity and it's going to be, green and everything, but I can't see any benefits, to be quite honest.
But has your electricity bill gone down?
Try double. It's doubled.
There are people who said, yeah, we've got all these turbines, but our electricity bill hasn't gone down a cent.
Yeah, I mean, it is a real challenge that. It's going to take time because we need to build more offshore wind.
So you think if there's more offshore wind, prices could go down?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fearing the war in Ukraine could lead to blackouts this winter, the UK government announced more drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea. They will also speed up the time it takes for new offshore wind projects to get online. Ben Sykes told us that over the next 8 years, Ørsted plans to invest another $17 billion in wind farms and add more than 300 jobs in Grimsby.
You know, the fishing industry was fantastic for Grimsby. That era has passed. What we want to do is to be part of creating the next chapter of Grimsby's life and of the country's life as we build out.
A chapter Bridie Salmon is very much a part of.
So that's gone from Grimsby being the fishing town to the powerhouse of the north, which is an amazing transition.
Proud of it?
So proud of it. And to be a part of it, it's amazing.
A town's future and fortune once again tied to the sea.